The interstate had been swallowing itself for the last 40 miles. What started as scattered flurries near Billings had thickened into a white curtain by the time Gideon Kirkland crossed into the mountain corridor west of Butte. The wipers couldn't keep pace anymore. Every few seconds the windshield turned opaque, then scraped clean, then buried again. His headlights didn't cut through the storm so much as illuminate it, turning the world into a swirling tunnel of white static. He'd been driving I-90 for 11 years, knew every grade and exit, every wide shoulder and hidden way station. This wasn't his first blizzard, not even his worst, but something about this one felt different. The CB had gone quiet an hour ago. No chatter from other drivers, no warnings about road conditions, just the hiss of dead air. His phone had lost signal somewhere near Deer Lodge. The digital clock on the dash read 9:47 p.m., but it felt later, deeper into the night than any clock could measure. Gideon had been hauling automotive parts out of Minnesota, a routine run he'd done a dozen times before. The load wasn't heavy, but it was bulky, and the trailer caught wind like a sail. Every gust that came down from the mountains hit him sideways, nudging the rig toward the shoulder. He kept both hands locked on the wheel, his jaw tight, eyes straining to find the lane markers buried somewhere beneath the drifts. The defroster roared at full blast, but condensation still crept along the edges of the glass. His thermos had gone cold 2 exits back. He'd meant to refill it at the last truck stop, but he'd been ahead of schedule then, still confident he could outrun the worst of it. That confidence was gone now. The road ahead bent slightly to the left, following the natural curve of the valley. Gideon eased off the throttle, letting the rig settle into the turn. His trailer swayed, tires hunting for grip on a surface that might as well have been ice. The Jake brake growled beneath him, a low, mechanical grumble that was one of the few sounds that still felt solid and real. Everything else, the wind, the snow, the silence on the radio, felt like the world dissolving around him. He checked his mirrors out of habit, but there was nothing behind him. No headlights, no taillights, no other fool still out here trying to make time. He was alone. That was when the fuel gauge caught his eye. The needle hovered just above a quarter tank. Not critical, not yet, but close enough to matter. He'd planned to fuel up in Missoula, but Missoula was still 60 miles west, and 60 miles in this storm might as well be 600. He did the math in his head, factoring in the wind resistance, the reduced speed, the constant work the engine was doing just to keep the rig moving forward. He could make it, probably. But probably wasn't the kind of word you wanted to bet your life on when the temperature outside was dropping toward single digits, and the nearest town was a name on a sign he couldn't even see anymore. He reached for the CB mic, more out of ritual than hope, and keyed it. Any drivers westbound on I-90 near mile marker 130, this is a eastbound freightliner looking for fuel options. Anybody copy? Static answered him. He tried again, adjusting the squelch, scanning through channels. Nothing. He set the mic back in its cradle and focused on the road, or what he could see of it. The snow was falling so thick now that it didn't look like individual flakes anymore. It was a solid mass, a living thing that pressed against the windshield and tried to bury the world. Then, through the white, he saw a glow. Faint at first. Just a smudge of yellow light that didn't belong to the storm. It grew as he approached, sharpening into the distinct shape of a building set back from the highway. A gas station. Old, from the look of it, the kind that had probably been standing here since the interstate was just a 2-lane state route. The sign out front was half buried in snow, but he could make out the words in peeling paint. Vern's Fuel and Service. No brand logo, no chain affiliation, just a name. The pumps were the old-fashioned kind, tall and narrow, with analog meters behind scratched glass, A single overhead light swung slightly in the wind, casting shifting shadows across the lot. Gideon felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made him dizzy. He eased the rig off the highway, tires crunching through a drift that had piled up across the exit ramp. The station sat at the edge of a frontage road that ran parallel to the interstate, bordered on one side by a dense line of pines and on the other by nothing but open space that vanished into the storm. There were no other vehicles in the lot, no other signs of life except for the light in the station's front window. It looked warm. It looked like salvation. He pulled the rig alongside the pumps, set the air brake, and killed the engine. The sudden silence was startling. Without the engine's rumble, the wind became the only sound, a low moan that rattled the trailer and made the whole rig creak like an old ship. Gideon sat for a moment, staring out at the station. The windows were fogged, but he could see movement inside, a shadow passing behind the glass. Someone was in there. He wasn't completely alone after all. He pulled his coat tighter, tugged his gloves on, and pushed open the driver's side door. The wind hit him like a fist, cold enough to steal his breath. Snow stung his face, tiny needles of ice that found every gap in his clothing. He dropped down from the cab, boots sinking into snow that was already past his ankles, and made his way toward the pumps. The cold bit through his jeans, turned his fingers stiff even inside the gloves. He moved quickly, fumbling with the nozzle, but when he tried to swipe his card, the reader just blinked red. No signal. Of course, Gideon glanced toward the station. The front door was just visible through the snow, a rectangular outline of dim yellow light. He'd have to go inside, pay cash, or wait for the system to come back online. Either way, he wasn't getting fuel without talking to whoever was in there. He replaced the nozzle, shoved his hands into his pockets, and started across the lot. Each step was a fight against the wind, which seemed determined to push him back toward the highway. By the time he reached the door, his face was numb, his breath coming in short, visible gasps. He pushed the door open and a wave of warm air rolled over him, thick with the smell of coffee, old grease, and something faintly sweet he couldn't place. The interior was small, cramped, lined with shelves stocked with canned goods, dusty boxes of crackers, and a few sad-looking bags of chips. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly greenish glow. Near the back, a narrow hallway led off into darkness, and to the left, a short counter separated the front of the store from a cluttered office space behind it. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 60s, maybe older, with a face like tanned leather and eyes that didn't blink as much as they should. He wore a flannel shirt rolled up to the elbows, grease stains on the cuffs, and a name tag pinned crookedly to his chest that read Vern in faded letters. He didn't smile when Gideon walked in, didn't nod or offer a greeting. He just watched, hands resting flat on the counter as if he'd been expecting someone but wasn't sure it would be Gideon. "Pumps are down," Vern said after a moment. His voice was rough, like gravel scraped across metal. "Storm killed the card readers about an hour ago. Cash only if you've got it." Gideon nodded, pulling off his gloves and stomping snow from his boots. "I've got cash, just need enough to get me to Missoula." Vern's eyes flicked toward the window, toward the storm beyond. "Missoula's a long way off in this. Road's getting worse by the minute. Plows won't be out till morning, maybe later." He paused, then added, "You might want to think about waiting it out here." Gideon hesitated. The idea of staying put, of not pushing forward, went against every instinct he had. Truckers didn't stop unless they had to. Stopping meant falling behind, missing delivery windows, losing money. But he also wasn't stupid. Vern was right. The road was getting worse, and if he slid off into a ditch or jackknifed on a grade, he'd be worse than stuck. He'd be dead. "How long you think this'll last?" Gideon asked, glancing back toward the door. Vern shrugged, a slow, almost lazy motion. Could be an hour. Could be all night. Weather up here does what it wants. He tilted his head slightly, studying Gideon with an expression that was hard to read. You're welcome to park out front. Keep warm inside if you like. Got coffee, got a booth in the back. Not much, but it's better than freezing in your cab. There was something off about the offer, though Gideon couldn't put his finger on what. Maybe it was the way Vern said it, too flat, too rehearsed, like he'd made the same offer before and was just going through the motions. Or maybe it was the way his eyes lingered a second too long, taking in details, measuring Gideon like a cut of meat. Gideon pushed the thought away. He was tired, cold, and rattled from the drive. Paranoia was easy when you were alone in a storm. Appreciate it, Gideon said, pulling out his wallet. Let me fuel up first, then I'll see how I feel. Vern nodded slowly and reached beneath the counter, pulling out an old-fashioned metal cash box. He opened it with a small key he kept on a chain around his neck, the hinges creaking. Pump 2's the only one still working. I'll turn it on manual. You fill up, come back in, and we'll settle. Gideon handed over 2 20s as a deposit, and Vern tucked them into the box without counting, then snapped it shut. The sound echoed in the small space, louder than it should have been. Gideon turned to leave, but Vern's voice stopped him. You see anyone else out there? Vern asked. On the road, I mean, before you pulled in. Gideon frowned. No. Why? Vern's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of something that might have been concern or might have been something else entirely. No reason. Just seems strange is all. You're the first person I've seen in 3 hours. Usually, get at least a couple trucks roll through even in weather like this. Gideon didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and stepped back out into the cold. The wind had picked up even more, and the snow was falling so hard now that he could barely see his own rig parked 20 feet away. He made his way to the pump, fumbling with the nozzle again, and this time it clicked into place. The fuel started flowing, the numbers on the analog meter spinning slowly as the tank filled. While he waited, Gideon looked around the lot, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his gut. The station was the only structure visible, isolated and alone at the edge of the highway. The pines behind it swayed in the wind, their branches heavy with snow, and beyond them there was nothing but darkness. He couldn't see the interstate from here, couldn't hear the distant hum of traffic. It was as if the storm had cut this place off from the rest of the world, left it floating in a pocket of silence and snow. The pump clicked off, startling him. He replaced the nozzle, flexed his stiff fingers, and trudged back toward the station. The warm air hit him again as he pushed through the door, and he was surprised at how relieved he felt to be inside, away from the wind and the cold. Vern was still behind the counter, in the same position, as if he hadn't moved at all. All set? Vern asked. Yeah, Gideon said, pulling out his wallet again. What do I owe you? Vern glanced at a notepad on the counter, though Gideon hadn't seen him write anything down. 68 even. Gideon counted out the bills and slid them across the counter. Vern took them, tucked them into the cash box, and locked it again. Then he looked up at Gideon, his expression unreadable. You staying then? Vern asked. Gideon hesitated. The smart move was to stay, the safe move. But something about this place, about Vern, about the way the light flickered and the silence pressed in from all sides made him want to get back in his rig and keep driving, storm or no storm. Before he could answer, the door behind the counter opened, and a woman stepped out. She was younger than Vern, maybe in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail and a face that might have been pretty once but was worn down now. tired in a way that went deeper than just lack of sleep. She wore a stained apron over jeans and a faded sweater, and she carried a pot of coffee in one hand. "Thought I heard someone out here," she said, her voice softer than Vern's but no warmer. She set the pot down on a hot plate behind the counter and looked at Gideon. "You the trucker?" "Yeah," Gideon said, "just fueling up." She nodded, wiping her hands on the apron. "I'm Tessa. I run the diner part of this place, such as it is. You hungry?" Gideon's stomach answered before he could, a low rumble that reminded him he hadn't eaten since early afternoon. "I could eat," he admitted. Tessa gestured toward the back of the station, where Gideon now noticed a small dining area, just 3 booths and a counter with stools. "Sit anywhere. I'll get you a menu." Gideon glanced at Vern, who was watching the exchange with that same flat, unreadable expression. Then he looked back at Tessa, who was already moving toward the dining area, coffee pot in hand. He told himself he was just being cautious, just doing what any smart driver would do, waiting out the storm in a warm place with hot food. But as he followed Tessa toward the booths, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made a decision he couldn't take back. The booth she led him to was against the far wall, beneath a window that looked out onto the storm. Gideon slid into the seat, the vinyl cracking under his weight, and accepted the laminated menu she handed him. It was sticky, the edges curled, and the photos of the food looked like they'd been taken sometime in the 1980s. Burgers, fries, eggs, toast. Nothing fancy, nothing that would win awards, but it would do. "Coffee?" Tessa asked, already pouring before he answered. "Yeah, thanks." She filled the mug, set the pot down on the table, and pulled a notepad from her apron pocket. "Know what you want, or you need a minute?" "Burger and fries," Gideon said, handing the menu back. "And maybe some pie, if you've got it." "Apple or cherry?" "Apple." She scribbled the order down, nodded, and walked back toward the kitchen. Gideon watched her go, then turned his attention to the window. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it looked worse, the snow so thick he couldn't even see his rig anymore. He wrapped his hands around the coffee mug, letting the heat seep into his fingers, and tried to relax. But he couldn't. Something about this place was wrong. He couldn't name it, couldn't point to any one thing and say, "There, that's the problem." It was more like a dozen small things that didn't quite add up. The way Vern watched him, the way Tessa moved, efficient but joyless, like she was going through the motions of a routine she'd performed 1,000 times before. The silence that filled the spaces between their words, heavy and oppressive, like the storm outside had seeped in through the walls. Gideon sipped his coffee and told himself he was overthinking it. He was tired, rattled from the drive, and letting his imagination run wild. This was just a gas station, just a diner, just 2 people trying to make a living in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing sinister about it. Nothing at all. But when Tessa came back a few minutes later with his food, and when she set the plate down in front of him without meeting his eyes, Gideon felt that unease twist tighter in his chest. And when he looked up and saw Vern standing in the doorway between the front counter and the dining area, arms crossed, watching him eat, Gideon knew with sudden, bone-deep certainty that he'd made a mistake coming inside. He just didn't know yet how bad that mistake was going to be. Gideon ate slowly, forcing himself to chew each bite, even though his appetite had vanished the moment he saw Vern watching from the doorway. The burger was decent enough, hot and greasy in the way diner food should be, but it tasted like cardboard in his mouth. He kept his eyes on his plate, tried to look casual, but every few seconds he'd glance up at the window, checking the storm, checking his rig, checking the distance between where he sat and the front door. Vern had moved back behind the counter, but Gideon could still feel the weight of his attention, could sense him listening to every scrape of fork against plate, every sip of coffee. Tessa emerged from the kitchen with the pie, setting it down without a word. The slice was massive, the crust golden and flaking at the edges, steam still rising from the filling. Under normal circumstances, Gideon would have been grateful. Now, it just felt like another anchor, another reason to stay seated when every instinct told him to get up and leave. He ate a few bites, the apples soft and sweet, and pushed the plate away. His stomach had knotted itself into something too tight to accept more food. "Not hungry?" Tessa asked, appearing at his elbow so quietly he hadn't heard her approach. She was holding the coffee pot again, already tilting it toward his mug before he could answer. "Just full," Gideon said, waving off the refill. "It was good, though, thanks." She nodded, but her eyes didn't match the gesture. They were flat, distant, like she was looking at him but not really seeing him. She glanced toward the counter, toward Vern, then back at Gideon. For a moment, he thought she might say something real, something that would explain the tension he felt vibrating through this place like a plucked wire. But she just picked up his plate, stacked it with the pie dish, and walked back toward the kitchen. The door swung shut behind her with a soft hiss, leaving Gideon alone in the dining area. He pulled out his wallet, counted out enough bills to cover the meal and a modest tip, and set them on the table. Then he stood, his knees stiff from the cold and the long hours behind the wheel, and made his way toward the front counter. Vern was still there, still in that same position, hands flat on the scarred laminate surface. Up close, Gideon noticed details he'd missed before. The man's fingernails were cracked and stained, the skin around them raw like he'd been picking at something. There was a faint smell coming off him, not quite sweat, not quite grease, but something sour and organic that made Gideon's stomach turn. "Heading back out?" Vern asked, though it didn't sound like a question. "Yeah," Gideon said. "Storm doesn't look like it's letting up, but I've got a schedule to keep." Vern's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Schedule won't matter much if you're dead in a ditch." Gideon bristled at that, the bluntness of it, but he kept his voice level. "I've driven worse." "Maybe," Vern said. "Maybe not." He reached under the counter again, and for a split second, Gideon's body tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his pocket where he kept a folding knife. But Vern just pulled out a road map, old and creased, and spread it on the counter. He tapped a spot with one stained finger. "You're here. Missoula's here. Between you and there, you've got 3 mountain passes, 2 of them above 6,000 feet. Winds gusting 40, 50 miles an hour up there. Visibility's 0. Even if the road's still open, which I doubt, you're looking at black ice under all that snow." Gideon stared at the map, at the snaking line of I-90 cutting through the mountains. Vern wasn't wrong. He knew that stretch, had driven it in winter before, and it was treacherous even in good conditions. In a storm like this, it would be suicide. But staying here felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate, a way that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the crawling sensation at the base of his skull. "I'll take my chances," Gideon said, folding the map closed and sliding it back across the counter. Vern didn't move to take it. He just looked at Gideon, his eyes narrow and calculating. "You don't strike me as a stupid man," he said slowly. "So why are you acting like one?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and accusatory. Gideon felt his jaw tighten, felt the anger rising, but he swallowed it down. Getting into an argument with this man wouldn't help anything. He needed to get out, get back to his rig, and put as much distance between himself and this place as possible. "I appreciate the concern," Gideon said, his tone clipped. "But I know what I'm doing." Vern held his gaze for another long moment, then shrugged, a slow, dismissive roll of his shoulders. Suit yourself. Just don't say I didn't warn you. Gideon turned toward the door, already reaching for the handle, when Vern spoke again. Radio's been picking up chatter, Vern said, casually, like he was commenting on the weather. Highway Patrol closed the interstate about 20 minutes ago, eastbound and westbound, from Butte to the Idaho line. Avalanche risk, they said. Won't reopen till tomorrow at the earliest. Gideon froze, his hand still on the door handle. He turned slowly, looking back at Vern. You're telling me this now? Vern's expression didn't change. Didn't seem relevant when you were so set on leaving. Gideon felt the anger flare again, hotter this time, but he forced it down. Losing his temper wouldn't change the situation. If the interstate was closed, he wasn't going anywhere, not tonight. He could try the frontage roads, maybe find an alternate route, but in this storm, in the dark, that was just as dangerous as trying to push through the passes. He was stuck. The realization settled over him like a weight, heavy and suffocating. Guess I'm staying then, Gideon said, his voice flat. Vern nodded, almost approvingly. Smart choice. You can park your rig out front, keep it close. There's a back room with a cot if you want to catch some sleep. Not much, but it's warm. Gideon didn't like the idea of being inside, away from his rig, away from his only means of escape. But the alternative, spending the night in his cab with the engine off, the temperature dropping and the storm raging outside, wasn't appealing either. He'd done it before, plenty of times, but something about tonight made the thought unbearable. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the unease that had been gnawing at him since he'd walked through the door. But either way, he needed rest, and he wasn't going to get it shivering in his sleeper. All right, Gideon said, finally. Show me the room. Vern came out from behind the counter, moving with a slow, deliberate gait that reminded Gideon of a predator conserving energy. He led the way past the dining area, down the narrow hallway Gideon had noticed earlier. The walls were bare except for a few faded posters advertising motor oil and tire brands that didn't exist anymore. The floor creaked under their weight, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. At the end of the hall, Vern stopped at a door and pulled a key from his pocket, unlocking it with a metallic click that echoed. The room beyond was small, barely large enough for the cot pushed against one wall and a battered wooden chair in the corner. A single, bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows. There was a window, but it was covered with a sheet of plywood nailed over the frame from the inside. The air smelled stale, like the room hadn't been opened in weeks, maybe months. Gideon stepped inside, his boots loud on the bare floor, and looked around. It wasn't much, but it would do. Bathroom's 2 doors down, Vern said from the doorway. Help yourself to more coffee if you want it. I'll be up front if you need anything. Gideon nodded, and Vern pulled the door closed, leaving him alone. He heard the man's footsteps recede down the hallway, slow and measured, then fade into silence. Gideon stood in the middle of the room, listening to the storm outside, the wind howling like something alive and hungry. He thought about going back out to his rig, grabbing his overnight bag, but the idea of stepping back into that cold, into that wind, felt insurmountable. He'd make do with what he had. He sat down on the cot, testing its strength. The springs groaned but held. He unlaced his boots, set them beside the bed, and lay back, staring up at the bulb overhead. He should turn it off, try to sleep, but the thought of being in this room in the dark made his skin crawl. Instead, he closed his eyes and tried to let the exhaustion pull him under. But sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept circling back to Vern, to Tessa, to the way this whole place felt like a stage set, like everything was arranged just so, waiting for him to play his part. He didn't know how long he lay there, minutes or hours, but eventually he heard voices. Faint at first, muffled by the walls, but growing clearer. He sat up, listening. It was Vern and Tessa, somewhere deeper in the building, their voices low but urgent. He couldn't make out the words, just the tone, the rhythm of an argument. Tessa's voice rose, sharp and pleading, and Vern's responded, flat and immovable. Then silence. Gideon stood, moving quietly to the door. He pressed his ear against it, listening. Nothing. He waited, counting his heartbeats, and then heard footsteps again, coming down the hall. He stepped back just as the door opened. Tessa stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed like she'd been crying. She looked at him, then quickly looked away. "Thought you might want another blanket," she said, holding out a faded quilt. "Gets cold in here at night." Gideon took it, noting the way her hands shook. "You all right?" he asked. She didn't answer, just turned and walked away, pulling the door closed behind her. Gideon stood there holding the blanket, his unease deepening into something closer to fear. He folded the quilt, set it on the cot, and moved to the door. He tried the handle. It turned easily, the door opening without resistance. At least he wasn't locked in. That was something. He stepped out into the hallway, moving quietly, and made his way toward the front of the station. The lights were still on, the fluorescent bulb still buzzing overhead. Vern was behind the counter again, but this time he wasn't alone. There was another man with him, someone Gideon hadn't seen before. He was younger, maybe in his 30s, wearing a stained jacket and jeans. His face was hard, angular, with eyes that moved constantly, never settling on one thing for long. He and Vern were speaking in low tones, their heads close together, but they stopped the moment they noticed Gideon. "Thought you were sleeping," Vern said, his voice neutral. "Couldn't," Gideon replied, keeping his own tone casual. "Thought I'd check on my rig." Vern exchanged a glance with the other man, something passing between them that Gideon couldn't read. "Road's even worse now," Vern said. "Drifts piled up past your bumper. You're not going anywhere till morning, maybe longer." Gideon didn't respond. He walked past them, pushed open the front door, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a wall, stealing his breath. He forced himself forward, trudging through snow that was now knee-deep, toward where he'd parked his rig. When he finally reached it, his heart sank. Vern hadn't been lying. The snow had buried the front end, piled up against the grill and over the hood. Even if he could get the engine started, he'd never get enough traction to pull out. He was trapped. He stood there for a moment, the wind tearing at his clothes, ice forming in his beard. Then he turned and looked back at the station. Through the fogged windows he could see Vern and the other man watching him. They weren't moving, weren't talking, just standing there waiting. And in that moment, Gideon understood with absolute clarity that he was in danger. Real danger. The kind that didn't announce itself with threats or violence, but with silence and patience and the slow methodical closing of a trap. He made his way back inside, brushing snow from his shoulders, forcing himself to act normal. Vern and the other man had moved apart, the stranger now leaning against the wall near the coffee machine, arms crossed. Gideon ignored him, ignored both of them, and walked back down the hallway to the room. He closed the door behind him, locked it this time, and dragged the chair over, wedging it under the handle. It wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in, but it would buy him a few seconds, maybe long enough to react. He sat on the cot, pulled out his phone, and checked for signal. Nothing. He tried the CB in his mind, replaying the last frequencies he'd used, but without access to his rig, it was useless. He was alone, cut off. with no way to call for help and nowhere to run. The storm outside was a wall, impassable and absolute, and the people inside this building, Vern, Tessa, the stranger, were something else. Something he didn't have a name for yet but could feel in the pit of his stomach like a stone. He thought about his wife, about the way she used to worry when he was on the road, the way she'd call and make him promise to be careful. He'd always laughed it off, told her he was fine, that nothing bad ever happened to guys like him. But she'd been right to worry. The road was dangerous, not just because of the miles and the weather and the machines, but because of the people you met along the way, the ones who saw a trucker as a mark, as someone with cash and no witnesses and no one who'd missed them for days. Gideon lay back on the cot, the springs groaning beneath him, and stared at the ceiling. He didn't close his eyes. He didn't dare. Instead, he listened to the wind, to the creak of the building settling, to the faint murmur of voices somewhere in the station. And he waited, counting the hours until dawn, praying that the light would bring the plows, the highway patrol, someone, anyone who could get him out of this place before whatever was waiting for him here decided it was time to make its move. The hours crawled by with the kind of slowness that only exists in the dead of night when you're too afraid to sleep. Gideon lay on the cot, fully dressed, boots back on his feet, the folding knife from his pocket now open and resting on his chest. He kept one hand on it at all times, feeling the weight of the blade, the coolness of the metal against his palm. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the building, wind screaming through gaps in the siding, snow piling higher against the walls. Inside, the silence was worse than any noise could have been. Around what he guessed was 2 a.m, he heard movement in the hallway. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, stopping outside his door. Gideon sat up quickly, gripping the knife, his eyes locked on the handle. It didn't turn. The footsteps stood there for what felt like an eternity, then moved on, fading back toward the front of the station. Gideon didn't relax. He counted to 60, then to 60 again, waiting to see if they'd come back. When they didn't, he stood and moved to the door, pressing his ear against it. He could hear voices again, 3 of them now. Vern's gravel rasp, Tessa's softer tones, and the third voice, the stranger's, rough and impatient. They were arguing about something, the words too muffled to make out, but the rhythm was unmistakable. One voice would rise, insistent, and the others would push back. It went on for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. Gideon heard a door slam somewhere deeper in the building, then silence again. He moved the chair away from the door and opened it just a crack, peering out into the hallway. The lights were still on, casting long shadows across the peeling linoleum. He could see the glow from the front counter, could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator cases. No movement. He slipped out of the room, moving as quietly as he could, and made his way down the hall. When he reached the edge of the front area, he stopped, staying in the shadows, and watched. Vern was behind the counter, sitting on a stool now, his head tilted back against the wall. His eyes were closed, but Gideon didn't think he was asleep. There was a tension in his posture, a readiness, like a spring coiled tight. The stranger was gone. Tessa was visible through the kitchen window, moving between the stove and the counter, cleaning something, her movements mechanical and repetitive. She looked exhausted, defeated, like whatever fight she'd been having, she'd lost. Gideon pulled back before either of them noticed him and returned to the room. He closed the door, wedged the chair back under the handle, and sat on the cot, thinking. He needed to understand what was happening here, needed to figure out whether he was in immediate danger or just being paranoid. The problem was, every instinct he had, every lesson he'd learned in 11 years on the road, was screaming at him that this place was wrong. Truckers developed a sixth sense about people, about situations. You had to. When you spent your life moving through truck stops and rest areas and roadside diners, places where strangers came and went and nobody asked questions, you learned to read the signs. And every sign here pointed to the same conclusion. He thought about trying to make a run for it, just grabbing his coat and heading out into the storm on foot. But where would he go? The interstate was closed, the frontage road was buried, and the nearest town was miles away through terrain he didn't know. In this cold, in this wind, he'd be dead within an hour. No, running wasn't an option. He had to stay, had to wait it out, and hope that dawn brought help. But waiting meant staying alert, staying ready. Gideon pulled the thermos from his coat pocket, the one he'd filled before leaving Minnesota, and unscrewed the cap. The coffee inside was cold, bitter, but he drank it anyway, forcing the caffeine into his system. He needed to stay awake, needed to keep his mind sharp. Sleep would leave him vulnerable, and vulnerable was the last thing he could afford to be right now. He checked his phone again, more out of habit than hope. Still no signal. He pulled up the photos stored in the memory, pictures of his wife from before she got sick, and scrolled through them slowly. Her smile, her laugh, the way she used to look at him like he was the only person in the world. It hurt to see them, hurt worse to think that he might never make it home to the small apartment where her memory still lived in every corner. But the hurt kept him focused, kept him angry, and anger was better than fear. At some point he must have dozed off despite himself because he jolted awake to the sound of breaking glass. His hand went to the knife immediately, his heart hammering in his chest. He listened, straining to hear over the wind. Another crash, followed by raised voices. He stood, moved to the door, and opened it again. The hallway was still lit, but the quality of the light had changed, flickering now, unstable. He moved toward it, knife in hand, and what he saw when he reached the front made his blood run cold. The front window, the big one that looked out onto the parking lot, was shattered. Snow was pouring through the opening, piling up on the floor in a growing drift. The wind howled through the gap, scattering papers and knocking over displays, and in the middle of it all stood Vern and the stranger, both of them staring at something outside. Tessa was against the far wall, her face pale, one hand pressed to her mouth. Gideon followed their gaze and saw it. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the light, barely visible through the snow. It was tall, hunched, moving in a way that didn't look quite right. For a moment, Gideon thought it might be another traveler, someone else caught in the storm. But then the figure stepped closer and he saw its face, or rather the absence of a face. It was wearing something over its head, a mask or a hood, dark and shapeless, and it swayed slightly as it stood there as if the wind was moving through it instead of against it. "Stay inside," Vern barked, his voice sharper than Gideon had heard it. He wasn't talking to Gideon. He was talking to the stranger who had started toward the broken window. "Don't be stupid." The stranger ignored him, stepping through the opening and out into the storm. The figure outside didn't move, didn't react, just stood there watching. The stranger approached it slowly, his hands raised, and said something Gideon couldn't hear over the wind. The figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion, and then it moved. Fast, too fast. It lunged forward, and the stranger went down, disappearing into the snow and the dark. Vern swore, a sharp, vicious sound, and grabbed something from under the counter. A shotgun, old and worn but functional. He pumped it once, the sound loud and final, and moved toward the window. Tessa screamed at him to stop, but he ignored her. He stepped through the broken glass, boots crunching on the shards, and raised the gun. The blast was deafening, a crack that echoed across the lot, and sent a flock of crows scattering from the pines. Gideon saw the muzzle flash, saw the snow kick up where the shot landed, but the figure was already gone. So was the stranger. Vern stood there for a moment, scanning the darkness, then backed into the station, the shotgun still raised. He turned and saw Gideon standing in the hallway, knife in hand, and for the first time since they'd met, something like respect flickered across his face. "Get back in your room," Vern said. "Lock the door. Don't come out till I tell you." "What the hell was that?" Gideon demanded. "Doesn't matter," Vern said. "Just do what I said." But Gideon didn't move. He looked at Tessa, who was trembling against the wall, tears streaming down her face. "Is he dead?" Gideon asked. "The guy who went out there?" Tessa didn't answer, just shook her head over and over, like she was trying to deny what she'd seen. Vern crossed to her, grabbed her by the arm, and pulled her toward the kitchen. "Get the boards," he told her. "We need to seal that window." Gideon watched them disappear into the back, then turned his attention to the broken window. Snow was still pouring in, the wind shrieking through the gap, and beyond it, the storm was an impenetrable wall. He thought about the stranger, about the way the figure had moved, and a part of him, the rational part that still believed in explanations and logic, tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was another traveler, someone driven mad by the cold and the isolation. Maybe it was a wild animal, a bear or a mountain lion, distorted by the storm and the dark into something more sinister. But he didn't believe that. He'd seen the way it moved, the intelligence behind it, the patience. That wasn't an animal. That was something else. Something that knew what it was doing, something that had been waiting for them. And the worst part, the part that made his skin crawl, was that Vern hadn't seemed surprised. Shocked, maybe, and angry, but not surprised, like this was something he'd expected, something he'd prepared for. Vern returned with an armful of plywood and a hammer, Tessa trailing behind him with a box of nails. They worked quickly, efficiently, nailing the boards over the broken window, sealing out the wind and the snow and whatever else was out there. When they were done, Vern set the hammer down and turned to Gideon. "You should have stayed in your room," he said. "Yeah," Gideon said. "Probably, but I didn't." Vern studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough. You want to make yourself useful. Help me drag the shelves in front of this. Won't stop much, but it'll slow things down if they try to come through again." Gideon wanted to ask who they were, wanted to demand answers, but he knew Vern wouldn't give them. Not now. So he just nodded and moved to help, gripping one end of a heavy metal shelf while Vern took the other. They dragged it across the floor, the legs screeching against the linoleum, and positioned it in front of the boarded window. Then they did the same with another shelf and another, building a makeshift barricade that looked flimsy and inadequate, but was better than nothing. When they were done, Gideon stepped back, breathing hard, and looked at Vern. The older man was sweating despite the cold, his face drawn and pale. "How long till morning?" Gideon asked. Vern glanced at the clock on the wall. 3, maybe 4 hours. And then what? Vern didn't answer. He just picked up the shotgun, checked the chamber, and moved to the counter, settling onto the stool with the gun across his lap. Tessa had disappeared into the kitchen again, and Gideon could hear her crying, soft and muffled, the sound of someone who'd been holding it in for too long. He thought about going to her, asking if she was okay, but he didn't. He had enough to worry about without taking on someone else's fear. Instead, he returned to the hallway, to the room with the cot and the boarded window. He closed the door, wedged the chair back under the handle, and sat down, the knife still in his hand. Outside, the storm raged on, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the walls, something waited. Gideon didn't know what it was, didn't know what it wanted, but he knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't finished with them yet. And when morning came, If morning came, he would have to decide whether to stay and face whatever this was, or take his chances with the storm and the road and the miles of empty space between here and anywhere else. For now, though, all he could do was wait. Wait and listen and hope that the barricades would hold, that the light would come, and that when it did, he'd still be alive to see it. Dawn came slowly, more as a gradual lessening of darkness than any real light. The storm had finally begun to ease, the wind dropping from a scream to a low moan, the snow thinning enough that Gideon could see shapes through the gaps in the boarded window. He'd spent the last hours in a state of rigid alertness, his body aching from tension, his mind cycling through every possible scenario and finding no good outcomes in any of them. The knife was still in his hand, the blade dulled slightly from where he'd been unconsciously running his thumb along the edge. He heard movement in the hallway and tensed, but it was just Tessa, her footsteps hesitant and shuffling. She knocked softly on his door, 3 quick taps, and called his name. "Gideon, you awake?" He stood, moved the chair, and opened the door. She looked worse than she had the night before, if that was possible. Her eyes were red and swollen, her skin pale and waxy, and there was a bruise forming along her jawline that hadn't been there earlier. She saw him notice it and turned her face away, one hand coming up to touch the spot gingerly. "Vern wants to talk to you," she said quietly. "Up front." Gideon nodded and followed her down the hallway. The station looked different in the gray morning light that filtered through the cracks in the boards. The barricade they'd built was still in place, the shelves angled awkwardly against the covered window, and there were dark stains on the floor near where the glass had shattered, stains that might have been melted snow or might have been something else. Vern was sitting at the counter, the shotgun within easy reach, a mug of coffee steaming in front of him. He looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. "Storm's breaking," Vern said without preamble. "Plows should be through by noon, maybe earlier. Highway patrol will open the interstate once they clear the passes." He paused, took a sip of coffee, and looked at Gideon over the rim of the mug. "You'll be able to leave then." Gideon pulled out a stool and sat across from him, keeping his distance. "What happened last night?" he asked. "What was that thing outside?" Vern set the mug down carefully, his movements deliberate. "You ever hear the old stories? About the mountain passes, the places where the snow gets so deep and the cold gets so bad that things stop making sense?" He didn't wait for an answer. "My grandfather used to tell them when I was a kid. Said there were stretches of road where travelers would disappear, where people would see things that shouldn't exist. I thought he was just trying to scare me, keep me from wandering off in winter. But you don't think that anymore," Gideon said. Vern shook his head slowly. "I've been running this station for 40 years. In that time, I've seen things I can't explain. People who come in out of the storm and then vanish before morning. Tracks in the snow that don't match any animal I know. Sounds at night that make your skin crawl." He looked toward the boarded window, his expression distant. "And sometimes, when the storms get bad enough, when the roads close and the world shrinks down to just this building and the dark around it, they come closer. They," Gideon repeated. "What are they?" "I don't know," Vern said, and for the first time he sounded old and tired and genuinely afraid. "And I don't want to know. All I know is that when they show up, people die. Sometimes quick, sometimes slow, but they always die. The stranger last night, he was the 4th this winter. There'll be more before spring." Gideon felt something cold settle in his stomach. "4th? You're saying this has happened before?" "Every winter," Vern said. "Ever since I can remember. My father dealt with it, his father before him. It's the price of being here, of keeping this place open when the storms come. Someone has to be here, has to keep the lights on, or they'll spread further, follow the highway, find the towns. He met Gideon's eyes, and there was something pleading in his gaze. You think I like this? You think I want to live like this? Gideon didn't answer. He was thinking about Tessa, about the bruise on her jaw, about the way she'd looked at him with those hollow, defeated eyes. And her? He asked, tilting his head toward where Tessa stood near the kitchen, listening but not coming closer. She part of this too? Vern's jaw tightened. She stays because she has nowhere else to go. I give her a place to sleep, food to eat, and in return, she helps me keep this place running, that's all. That's all, Gideon repeated flatly. He didn't believe it, not for a second, but he also knew pushing the point wouldn't get him anywhere. Vern was a man who'd made his choices, however dark they were, and lived with them. Gideon wasn't going to change that in the few hours he had left here. He stood, the stool scraping against the floor. I want to check my rig. Make sure it's still drivable. Vern nodded. I'll come with you. Not safe to go out alone, even in daylight. They geared up in silence, pulling on coats and gloves, and stepped out through the front door. The cold was still brutal, but without the wind driving it, it was bearable. The snow had stopped completely, leaving the world draped in white, pristine and deceptively peaceful. Gideon's rig was exactly where he'd left it, buried up to the axles, but when he climbed up and tried the ignition, the engine turned over after a few reluctant coughs. He let it run, warming up while he did a walk around. The tires were fine, the trailer intact, nothing damaged beyond what the storm had already done. He was checking the fifth wheel coupling when he noticed the tracks. They started near the tree line, came across the lot in a wandering, uneven path, and stopped just a few feet from where his rig was parked. They were human-shaped, roughly, but wrong. Too long, too narrow, the spacing between them irregular like whatever made them had been limping or dragging something. Gideon crouched down, studying them, and felt his skin prickle. The snow around the tracks was discolored, stained a faint yellowish brown, and there was a smell, faint but distinct, like rotten meat left out in the sun. Don't touch it, Vern said from behind him. Gideon turned and saw the older man standing a few feet back, the shotgun cradled loosely in his arms. Just leave it be. What is it? Gideon asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Nothing you need to worry about, Vern said, as long as you're gone by noon. Gideon straightened, brushing snow from his knees, and looked at Vern. The man's face was hard, closed off, but there was something else there too, something that looked almost like regret. You could leave, Gideon said. Close this place down, walk away, you and Tessa both. Vern shook his head. Told you already. Someone has to be here. If it's not me, it'll be someone else. And they might not know what they're dealing with till it's too late. At least I know the rules, know how to keep them at bay. He paused, looking out at the tree line, at the mountains beyond. This is my burden. Has been for a long time. I'm not asking you to understand it, just asking you to leave when the time comes and not look back. Gideon wanted to argue, wanted to tell the man he was insane, that whatever he thought he was doing here wasn't worth the cost, but he could see in Vern's eyes that it wouldn't matter. The man had made his peace with this a long time ago, or if not peace, at least acceptance. And Gideon wasn't a hero, wasn't equipped to save anyone. He was just a trucker trying to survive long enough to get back on the road. They went back inside, stamping snow from their boots. Tessa had made more coffee, and the smell filled the station, warm and almost normal. Gideon poured himself a cup and sat at one of the booths, watching the clock on the wall tick forward. The minutes dragged, each one feeling like an hour, but eventually he heard it. The distant rumble of a plow, the scrape of its blade against asphalt, getting closer. He stood and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the boards, and saw the orange flash of lights coming down the frontage road. Vern appeared beside him, watching. "That's your cue," he said. Gideon nodded, set his coffee down, and pulled on his coat. He turned to Tessa, who was standing near the counter, her arms wrapped around herself. "You sure you won't come?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. She shook her head, not meeting his eyes. "I can't. This is where I am." Gideon didn't push. He just nodded, pulled his gloves on, and headed for the door. Vern followed him outside, standing on the step as Gideon climbed into his rig. The engine was still running, warm and ready, and the plow had cleared enough of the lot that he could back out without getting stuck. He put the truck in gear, eased off the brake, and started to roll. As he pulled onto the frontage road, he glanced in the mirror one last time. Vern was still standing there, the shotgun at his side, watching. Behind him, barely visible through the window, Gideon could see Tessa's silhouette, small and still. And beyond them, at the edge of the tree line, there was movement. Just a shape, dark and indistinct, swaying slightly in the wind. Gideon looked away, focused on the road ahead, and kept driving. He merged onto I-90 an hour later, the highway clear and salted, traffic starting to pick up as other drivers ventured back out. His CB crackled to life, voices filling the cab with chatter about weather and road conditions and the best routes west. Gideon listened but didn't join in. He just drove, putting miles between himself and that station, between himself and whatever was waiting in those mountains. 2 days later, when he finally rolled into a truck stop outside Spokane, he tried calling the highway patrol, asked if they'd had any reports from Vern's fuel and service, any missing persons, anything unusual. The dispatcher told him there was no record of a station by that name on I-90, no business license, no incidents reported. She suggested he might be thinking of a different road, a different state. Gideon thanked her and hung up. He thought about going back, about trying to find the place again, but he knew he wouldn't. Some roads you only travel once, and some places you're lucky to leave at all. He'd gotten out. That was enough. He told himself it had to be enough. But sometimes, late at night when he's parked at a rest stop or idling at a fuel island, he thinks about Tessa, about the look in her eyes, the bruise on her jaw, the way she'd said, "This is where I am," like it was a sentence she'd already served too many years of. He thinks about Vern, standing in the snow with his shotgun, guarding a place that shouldn't exist against things that shouldn't be real. And he thinks about the tracks, the stains, the shape moving at the tree line. Mostly, though, he thinks about the stranger who'd gone out into the storm and never come back, about how easily that could have been him, how close he'd come to being the fourth, or the fifth, or just another name that nobody would remember by spring. He doesn't stop at isolated stations anymore, doesn't pull off at exits that look too quiet, too empty. He plans his routes carefully, sticks to the main corridors, the places with lights and cameras and other drivers. And when the snow starts falling and the forecast calls for a storm, he finds a truck stop and waits it out, engine idling, doors locked, eyes on the mirrors. Because he learned something in that station, something Vern had tried to tell him without ever saying it outright. There are places on the map where the rules are different, where the dark is deeper and the cold cuts through more than just flesh. Places where people like Vern make bargains they can't break, and people like Tessa get trapped in lives they can't escape. And if you're smart, if you're lucky, you drive past those places without ever knowing they're there. Gideon wasn't that lucky. But he was smart enough to leave, and he never, ever went back. Merle Thatcher had been driving trucks for 23 years, and in that time, he'd learned that North Dakota in February was less a place than a test of endurance. The kind of landscape that stripped away everything soft and left only bone. Flat prairie stretching to the horizon in every direction. Wind that came straight down from Canada with nothing to stop it. And cold that turned metal brittle and made diesel gel in the lines if you weren't careful. He'd run this route, Fargo to Williston, more times than he could count, hauling equipment for the oil fields that dotted the western part of the state like industrial scabs. Tonight, though, he'd taken a detour. The main highway had been closed due to a jackknifed semi near Jamestown, and the dispatcher had routed him south on a series of county roads that Merle barely recognized from his atlas. Two-lane blacktop that ran straight as a rifle shot through empty farmland. No towns, no services, just the occasional cluster of buildings huddled against the wind. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating snow that swirled across the road in serpentine patterns, and every few miles he'd pass an abandoned farmhouse, windows dark and empty, slowly being reclaimed by the prairie. The storm had started an hour ago, light at first, just flurries that danced in his headlights like moths. But it was building now, the flakes getting bigger and falling faster, and the wind was picking up, pushing against the side of his trailer hard enough that he had to fight the wheel to keep it straight. Merle checked his fuel gauge out of habit. 3/4 full. Plenty to get him to Williston, even if he had to slow down. His phone showed no signal, hadn't for the last 40 miles, but that was normal out here. The radio was nothing but static, and the CB was dead quiet. No other trucks, no chatter, just the hum of his engine and the whistle of wind through the door seals. He was somewhere south of Harvey, or at least he thought he was when he saw the lights. Faint at first, just a yellow glow against the snow, but as he got closer they resolved into shapes. Flares, the kind highway patrol used to mark an accident scene, burning bright orange and sputtering in the wind. They were arranged in a line across the road, forcing him to slow down, and beyond them, barely visible through the snow, Merle could see vehicles. 3 of them, maybe 4, stopped at odd angles like they'd pulled over in a hurry. Merle eased off the throttle, downshifting, and brought his rig to a stop about 50 feet back from the flares. He set the air brake, left the engine running, and stared out at the scene. It didn't look right. The vehicles were too close together, too organized for a random breakdown, and there was no sign of highway patrol, no cruiser with its lights flashing, no trooper directing traffic. Just the flares and the vehicles and the snow falling between them like a curtain. He reached for his CB mic, keyed it, and spoke into the silence. "This is a northbound Kenworth at mile marker. Hell, I don't even know. Anybody got eyes on an accident scene south of Harvey? Multiple vehicles, flares in the road. Requesting advise." Static answered him. He tried again, adjusting the squelch, cycling through channels. Nothing. The CB might as well have been a paperweight. Merle sat there for a moment, engine idling, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct told him to just go around, ease past the flares on the shoulder, and keep moving. Truckers didn't stop for strangers on empty roads at night, not unless they had to. Too many stories of rigs getting robbed, drivers getting hurt or worse. But he could see movement now, a figure stumbling between the vehicles waving an arm like they were trying to flag him down. The figure was small, hunched against the wind, and even from this distance Merle could tell they were in trouble. He swore under his breath, pulled his coat tighter, and grabbed the heavy maglite from the door pocket. If this was a setup, if someone was trying to box him in, at least he'd have something to swing. He killed the headlights, leaving just his running lights on, and climbed down from the cab. The cold hit him like a fist, wind stealing his breath and burning his exposed skin. He tucked his chin into his collar and started forward, boots crunching through snow that was already ankle-deep. As he got closer, the scene came into focus. 3 vehicles just like he'd thought. A sedan, an older model Buick with North Dakota plates, its front end crumpled against a utility pole that leaned at a dangerous angle. Behind it, a pickup truck, newer, Ford or Chevy, hood up and steam rising from the engine block. And beyond that, pulled onto the shoulder, a van. White, windowless. The kind contractors used to haul tools. All three had their hazards on, lights blinking in unison, and the flares were arranged between them, creating a perimeter of flickering orange light. The figure he'd seen was standing near the sedan, one hand braced against the roof for support. As Merle approached, they turned toward him, and he saw it was a woman. Middle-aged, wearing a heavy coat that was too big for her frame, and a wool hat pulled down over her ears. Her face was pale, lips almost blue, and her eyes were wide with something that looked like fear or shock or both. "Thank God," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't think anyone was coming. The road's been empty for over an hour." Merle stopped a few feet away, the mag light raised but not aimed at her, more as a precaution than a threat. "You all right? Anybody hurt?" She nodded, then shook her head, like she couldn't decide which answer was true. "I'm okay. Shaken up, but okay. There's a man in the pickup, he's hurt, and there's someone in the van, but I haven't seen them move since I got here." Merle looked past her at the pickup. The driver's side door was open and he could see a shape slumped over the wheel. "What happened?" he asked. "I don't know," the woman said. "I was driving north coming back from Bismarck, and when I came around that curve they were already here. I tried to stop, but the road was icy and I hit the pole. When I got out, I saw the pickup and the van, and I set out the flares because I thought someone might come along and hit us." She paused, wiping snow from her face, but nobody did. Not until you. Merle studied her, looking for signs of deception, anything that would tell him this was a trap. But all he saw was a scared woman who'd gotten caught in a bad situation. He lowered the flashlight slightly and nodded. "All right, let me check on the others. You stay by your car, try to stay warm." She nodded gratefully and retreated to the Buick, climbing into the driver's seat and pulling the door closed. Merle moved toward the pickup, his boots sliding on the ice beneath the snow. The driver was a man, maybe in his 50s, with graying hair and a face that was already starting to bruise. There was blood on his forehead, a nasty gash that was still bleeding, and his eyes were closed. Merle reached in and pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, faint and thready, but steady. "Hey," Merle said, shaking the man's shoulder gently. "Can you hear me?" The man's eyelids fluttered, and he let out a low groan. His lips moved, forming words that Merle couldn't make out. Merle leaned closer and the man's eyes opened, unfocused and glassy. "Van," he whispered. Don't go near the van." Merle frowned. "Why? What's in the van?" But the man's eyes had already closed again, his head lolling to the side. Merle straightened, looking toward the white van sitting on the shoulder. The back doors were closed, no windows to see through, and the hazard lights were still blinking in that steady, hypnotic rhythm. He thought about the man's warning, about the fear in his voice, and felt something cold settle in his gut that had nothing to do with the weather. He approached the van slowly, the maglite raised again, its beam cutting through the falling snow. The driver's side door was locked, the window fogged over from the inside. Merle tapped on the glass with the butt of the flashlight, the sound sharp and metallic. "Hey, anybody in there?" No response. He moved to the back, tried the handles on the rear doors. Locked. He knocked again, harder this time. "If you can hear me, I'm here to help. Open up." Silence. Just the wind and the hiss of snow against metal. Merle stepped back, shining the light across the van's exterior. No damage that he could see, no signs of a collision. The tires were fine, the body intact. It looked like it had just pulled over and stopped, like whoever was driving had decided to park in the middle of nowhere during a snowstorm and wait, which made no sense at all. He was about to turn away when he heard it. A sound from inside the van, faint but distinct. A scrape, like something being dragged across a metal floor. Then a thump, heavy and deliberate. Merle froze, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. "Hello?" he called again, his voice sharper now. The thumping came again 3 times in quick succession, then stopped. Merle backed away from the van, his mind racing. Something was wrong here, wrong in a way he couldn't articulate but could feel in every nerve. He turned and walked quickly back to the woman's car, knocking on her window. She rolled it down a crack, looking up at him with those wide, frightened eyes. "The guy in the pickup," Merle said. "He tell you anything about the van?" She shook her head. "No, why?" "He said not to go near it, and there's something inside, something making noise, but nobody's answering." The woman's face went even paler, if that was possible. "Maybe they're hurt, maybe they can't get to the door." "Maybe," Merle said, though he didn't believe it. If someone was hurt, they'd call out, make some kind of sound beyond thumping on the floor. Unless they couldn't. Unless they were restrained or gagged, or something worse. He looked back at the van, at the way it sat there in the snow, dark and silent and somehow menacing despite being an inanimate object. "I'm going to try the door again," Merle said. "If something happens, if you hear anything that sounds wrong, you get in your car and you drive. Doesn't matter if the engine's shot or the front end's smashed, you put it in gear and you go. Understand?" The woman nodded, her hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Merle turned and walked back toward the van, every step feeling heavier than the last. He reached the rear doors and set the flashlight on the ground, angling it upward so it illuminated the handles. Then he pulled out his folding knife, the same one he'd used to cut straps and open boxes for years, and wedged the blade into the gap between the doors. The lock was cheap, the kind you could buy at any hardware store, and it gave way with a metallic pop that sounded too loud in the quiet. Merle grabbed the handle and pulled, and the door swung open, revealing the dark interior of the van. He picked up the flashlight and shone it inside, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The van was empty. No cargo, no tools, no seats beyond the drivers and passengers up front. Just bare metal walls and floor, and in the center, a single shape. A man lying on his side, wrists and ankles bound with zip ties, a strip of duct tape across his mouth. His eyes were open, staring at Merle with an expression of pure terror, and he was shaking his head frantically, making muffled sounds behind the tape. Merle started to climb in, to help the man, but then he heard footsteps behind him. Fast, deliberate, crunching through the snow. He spun around just in time to see a figure rushing toward him, arm raised. Something metal glinting in their hand. Merle tried to dodge, but his feet slipped on the ice, and the world exploded into pain and darkness as something struck the side of his head. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs, and felt hands grabbing him, dragging him toward the van. He tried to fight, tried to push them away, but his vision was blurred and his limbs felt like they were filled with lead. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him completely was the woman from the Buick, standing over him with a tire iron in her hands, her face no longer frightened but calm, almost businesslike. And behind her, stepping out of the pickup with that same predatory efficiency, was the man who'd been slumped over the wheel, the blood on his forehead nothing but stage makeup smeared in all the wrong places. Then the van doors slammed shut, and everything went black. Pain was the first thing Merle became aware of, a throbbing ache that pulsed through his skull in time with his heartbeat. The second was cold, bone deep and unrelenting, seeping through his clothes and into his skin. He tried to move and found he couldn't. His wrists were bound behind his back, the plastic of zip ties cutting into his flesh, and his ankles were similarly secured. He was lying on his side on a hard metal surface that vibrated beneath him, the unmistakable sensation of a vehicle in motion. He opened his eyes slowly, fighting against the nausea that welled up in his throat. The interior of the van was dark, lit only by faint illumination that filtered through the gap between the front seats. He could make out shapes now, the man who'd been tied up when he'd first opened the doors, still lying in the same position, eyes closed. Whether he was unconscious or dead, Merle couldn't tell. The tape was still over his mouth, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Alive, then, for now, Merle tested the zip ties carefully, trying to work his wrists without making noise. The plastic bit deeper into his skin, drawing blood, but didn't give. They'd been pulled tight, professional, like whoever had done this had practice. He twisted his head, trying to see through the gap to the front of the van, and caught a glimpse of two figures in the driver and upper passenger seats. The woman who'd pretended to be a victim was driving, her hands steady on the wheel, and the man who'd played injured was in the passenger seat, talking in a low voice that Merle couldn't quite make out over the engine noise. He lay still, forcing himself to breathe slowly, to think. The blow to his head had left him disoriented, his thoughts sluggish and hard to pin down, but he knew he needed to focus. He'd been in tight situations before, close calls on icy roads, near misses with drunk drivers, but nothing like this. This was different. This was deliberate, calculated, and the fact that they'd gone to the trouble of tying him up instead of just leaving him in the snow meant they wanted him alive. The question was why. The van hit a bump, and Merle's head bounced against the metal floor, sending fresh waves of pain through his skull. He bit down on a groan, not wanting to alert his captors that he was awake. The other man in the van stirred slightly, his eyes opening to slits. He looked at Merle, and there was something in his gaze, a warning or a plea, Merle couldn't tell which. Then his eyes flicked toward the front seats and back, and he shook his head almost imperceptibly. Merle understood. Don't let them know you're awake. Don't give them a reason to do anything worse than they've already done. He closed his eyes again, listening to the sound of the tires on pavement, trying to gauge how long they'd been driving. His internal clock, honed by years of calculating hours and miles, told him it had been maybe 20 or 30 minutes since he'd been knocked out. Not long, but long enough that they could be anywhere within a 50-mile radius of where he'd stopped. The voices in the front seat grew clearer as the engine noise dropped, the van slowing down. Merle kept his eyes closed but strained to hear, picking out words and phrases through the haze of pain. Should have just left him, the man was saying. Too risky bringing another one in. We need the truck, the woman replied, her voice calm and matter-of-fact. And he's the only one who can move it. Ruford will figure out the rest. Ruford, the name stuck in Merle's mind. Something to hold on to, a detail that might matter later, if there was a later. What about the other one? The man asked. He's been out for hours, might not wake up. Then we'll deal with it, the woman said. Either way, we're not going back empty-handed, not after the last time. The van turned sharply, the motion pressing Merle against the wall. He felt the surface beneath him change, pavement giving way to gravel, the ride rougher now, the engine straining as they climbed a slight incline. Then they stopped, the engine idling for a moment before cutting out completely. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise, oppressive and thick, broken only by the whistle of wind outside. The front doors opened, and Merle heard boots hitting gravel, two sets of footsteps moving around to the back of the van. He kept his eyes closed, his body limp, as the rear doors opened and cold air rushed in. Hands grabbed him under the arms and dragged him out, his boots scraping against the metal floor and then hitting the ground. He let himself be dead weight, didn't resist, and through slitted eyelids he caught glimpses of his surroundings. They were in a clearing of some kind, surrounded by trees that loomed black against the gray sky. There were buildings, old and weathered, a farmstead or ranch that had been abandoned long enough for nature to start reclaiming it. A barn with a sagging roof, a house with boarded windows, and several smaller outbuildings scattered around the property. Snow covered everything, untouched except for tire tracks that led from the road to where the van was parked. The man and woman dragged Merle across the clearing toward the barn, his heels leaving twin furrows in the snow. They kicked open a side door and pulled him inside, the interior dim and smelling of rot and old hay. They dropped him on the floor, and Merle heard the woman say, "Get the other one. I'll go find Ruford." Footsteps receded, and Merle risked opening his eyes fully. The barn was bigger than it had looked from outside, the ceiling high and crisscrossed with beams, some of them broken and hanging at dangerous angles. There were stalls along one wall, most of them empty, but in the far corner he could see movement. Shapes, human shapes, huddled together. His stomach turned. The man returned a moment later, dragging the other captive from the van. He dropped him next to Merle, then stood there for a moment, breathing hard, looking down at them with an expression that was part frustration, part resignation. He was younger up close, maybe early 40s, with a face that might have been handsome once but was now lined and hard. He pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and took a long drag before speaking. "Don't bother trying to get loose," he said, his voice flat. "Those ties are rated for 200 pounds. You're not breaking them, and nobody's coming to help you. This place is 20 miles from the nearest road, and even if you could walk that far in this weather, you wouldn't make it past the tree line before Ruford's dogs found you." Merle didn't respond, just stared up at the man, memorizing his face, the scar above his left eyebrow. The way he favored his right leg like an old injury still bothered him. Details that might matter if he survived this. The man took another drag and exhaled smoke into the cold air. "For what it's worth," he said, "I didn't want to do this, but you stopped, and that made you a problem. Ruford doesn't like problems." Before Merle could process that, the barn door opened again, and two more figures stepped inside. One was the woman, and the other was a man Merle hadn't seen before. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a thick beard gone mostly gray, and eyes that were cold and calculating. He wore a heavy canvas coat stained with grease and dirt, and he moved with the confidence of someone who owned everything he surveyed. "This him?" the man asked, his voice rough like he'd spent too many years breathing diesel fumes and cigarette smoke. "Yeah," the woman said. "Trucker, stopped to help. He's got a rig back on the county road, full tank, clean tags." The older man, Ruford, Merle assumed, crouched down beside him, studying his face with the detachment of someone evaluating livestock. "You know how to move a Kenworth?" he asked. Merle considered not answering, but the look in Ruford's eyes told him that silence would only make things worse. "Yeah," he said, his voice hoarse. Ruford nodded. "Good, that makes this easier." He stood and looked at the woman. "Eudora, get the medical kit. Check him for injuries. I need him functional, not bleeding out." He turned to the younger man. "And you, get the chains. If he gives us any trouble, we'll remind him what happens to people who don't cooperate." The woman, Eudora, nodded and disappeared through a door at the back of the barn. The younger man walked to one of the stalls and returned with a length of heavy chain and a padlock. He wrapped it around Merle's chest and arms, securing it so tight that Merle could barely expand his lungs to breathe, then locked it with a snap that echoed through the barn. Ruford watched the whole process with the same clinical detachment, then gestured toward the far corner where Merle had seen the other figures. Put him with the others. Let him see what cooperation looks like. The younger man grabbed the chain and dragged Merle across the floor, the metal scraping against concrete, and dumped him in the corner. Merle looked around and felt his heart sink. There were 4 people huddled there, 3 men and 1 woman, all bound like he was, all wearing the same expression of exhausted terror. They looked like they'd been here for days, maybe longer, their faces gaunt and their clothes filthy. One of the men, older with white hair, met Merle's eyes and gave a small shake of his head, a gesture that said everything without words. Don't fight. It only makes it worse. Eudora returned with a small canvas bag and knelt beside Merle, pulling out gauze and antiseptic. She worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning the gash on his head where he'd been struck, wrapping it with practiced hands. Up close, Merle could see that she wasn't as old as he'd first thought, maybe late 30s, and there was something in her face, a hardness that looked like it had been earned rather than born into. "You a nurse?" Merle asked quietly. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Was, long time ago." She finished wrapping the bandage and stood. "Try to keep pressure off it. You're going to need your strength." "For what?" Merle asked. She didn't answer, just picked up her bag and walked away. Ruford was waiting by the door, arms crossed, and he watched Merle with the same calculating gaze. "You're going to help us move some cargo," he said. "Trucks, equipment, things we've acquired that need to get from here to there without attracting attention. You do that, you cooperate, and maybe you walk away from this. You don't, and you end up like them." He gestured toward the other corner of the barn, and Merle followed the motion with his eyes. There, partially hidden by shadows, were shapes covered with tarps. The outline was unmistakable. Bodies. At least 3, maybe more, stacked like cordwood and left to freeze. Merle felt bile rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down. Panic wouldn't help him, wouldn't save him. He needed to think, needed to find an opening, a weakness, anything he could exploit. But right now, chained and outnumbered, with no idea where he was or how far help might be, his options were limited to one: survive. Stay alive long enough to find a way out. Ruford turned to leave, the woman and the younger man following him. The barn door closed with a heavy thud, and Merle heard the sound of a padlock clicking into place. He was alone now with the other captives, and the silence that settled over them was broken only by the wind outside and the occasional creak of the barn settling. The white-haired man shifted closer, moving with the slow, pained effort of someone who'd been bound too long. "Name's Harold," he whispered. "How long you been here?" "Just got here," Merle said. "You?" "5 days," Harold said. "Maybe 6. Hard to keep track." He gestured to the others. "This is Anita, and that's Rick and Paul. We're all truckers, all stopped to help when we saw what we thought was an accident. Same as you, I'm guessing." Merle nodded, his mind racing. "What do they want?" "Rigs," Harold said. "Clean ones, with good tags they can use to move stolen equipment. Oil field gear mostly. Generators, compressors, anything they can strip and sell. They've been hitting job sites all over the state, but they need trucks to move it, and they can't risk using their own. So they take ours, and they take us to drive them." "And after?" Merle asked, though he already knew the answer. Harold's face darkened. "They don't let us go, if that's what you're asking. Once you've served your purpose, you're a liability, and Ruford doesn't leave loose ends." Merle looked toward the tarps in the corner, toward the shapes beneath them, and felt cold settle into his bones that had nothing to do with the temperature. He'd walked into a trap, and now he was caught in something far worse than he could have imagined. A network, organized and ruthless, using the isolation of the prairie and the trust of drivers against them. But he wasn't dead yet. And as long as he was breathing, there was a chance. He just had to find it. The hours dragged by in the freezing darkness of the barn. Merle's body had gone from shivering to a kind of numb stillness that he knew was dangerous, the first stage of hypothermia setting in. The other captives huddled close for warmth, their breath visible in the frigid air, and nobody spoke much. What was there to say? They were all living the same nightmare, all counting down the hours until Ruford decided they'd outlived their usefulness. Harold was the one who finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. The younger guy, the one who helps Eudora with the fake accidents, his name's Carl. He's Ruford's nephew, been doing this for about 2 years. Eudora's been here longer, maybe 4 or 5 years. She was a trauma nurse in Fargo before something went wrong before she ended up here. Merle turned his head to look at the older man. You've been watching them. Not much else to do, Harold said. I figure if I'm going to die here, I might as well understand who's killing me. He paused, shifting his weight to ease the pressure on his bound wrists. Ruford runs a salvage operation on paper. Legitimate business buying and selling used equipment. But the real money comes from theft. He's got contacts at drilling sites, people who tell him when shipments are coming in, when security's light. Then he hits them, strips the equipment, and moves it through a network of buyers in Wyoming and Montana. And the trucks? Merle asked. Insurance, Harold said. He can't risk using his own vehicles too many times. Plates get flagged, patterns emerge, so he uses ours. Forces us to drive loads across state lines, then ditches the rigs in remote locations where they won't be found for months. By the time anyone connects the dots, the equipment's already been sold and he's moved on to the next job. Merle absorbed this, his mind working through the implications. How many drivers has he taken? Harold's expression darkened. I've seen 8 come through here since I arrived. 5 are under those tarps. 2 got moved to a different location, maybe still alive, maybe not. And now there's you. The woman, Anita, spoke up for the first time, her voice thin and strained. He'll make you drive tomorrow. That's how it works. He'll take you back to your rig, make you move it here, and then he'll load it with whatever he's stolen. If you refuse, he'll hurt one of us to show you he's serious. If you cooperate, he'll let you live just long enough to make the delivery, and then— She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Merle tested the chains again, feeling the cold metal bite into his chest. His mind raced through scenarios, escape plans, anything that might give him an edge. But chained, outnumbered, and in unfamiliar territory, his options were brutally limited. He needed leverage, something to bargain with, or he needed to create an opportunity where none existed. The barn door opened suddenly, the sound of the padlock scraping loud in the silence, and Ruford stepped inside, followed by Carl. The older man carried a battery-powered lantern that cast harsh shadows across the walls, and Carl had a shotgun cradled in his arms, finger near the trigger but not on it. They crossed the barn to where the captives sat, and Ruford set the lantern down, studying each face in turn before settling on Merle. Time to earn your keep, Ruford said. We're going to take a little drive, you and me and Carl. You're going to bring your truck back here nice and easy, no problems. You do that, and everyone here stays comfortable. You try anything stupid, and I start shooting people until you change your mind. We clear? Merle met his gaze, saw the absolute certainty there, and knew the man wasn't bluffing. Clear, he said. Ruford nodded to Carl, who stepped forward and unlocked the chain around Merle's chest. The relief was immediate, his lungs expanding fully for the first time in hours, but Carl didn't remove the zip ties on his wrists or ankles. Instead, he cut the ankle restraints with a utility knife and hauled Merle to his feet. Merle's legs nearly gave out, numb from hours of immobility, but he forced them to hold, swaying slightly as blood rushed back into his extremities. "Walk," Ruford said, gesturing toward the door. They left the barn, stepping out into a night that had grown even colder. The snow had stopped, leaving the world crystalline and silent under a sky scattered with stars. The van was parked where they'd left it, and Carl shoved Merle into the back, climbing in after him while Ruford took the driver's seat. The engine turned over with a cough, and they pulled out of the clearing, headlights cutting through the darkness as they bounced down the gravel road. Merle sat in the back, his bound wrists resting on his knees, and watched the trees slide past through the rear windows. He was memorizing the route, counting turns, noting landmarks. A fallen tree with exposed roots, a rusted tractor abandoned in a field, a mailbox leaning at a 45-degree angle. Details that might help him find his way back if he ever got the chance to run. They drove for about 20 minutes before emerging onto the county road where Merle had first stopped. His rig was still there, sitting dark and silent in the snow, untouched. The fake accident scene had been cleared away, the flares extinguished, the sedan and pickup gone. It was like nothing had ever happened, like Merle had imagined the whole thing. But the throbbing pain in his head and the zip ties cutting into his wrists told a different story. Ruford pulled the van alongside the Kenworth and killed the engine. He turned in his seat, looking back at Merle. "Keys," he said. Merle hesitated, then nodded toward his coat pocket. Carl reached in, pulled out the key ring, and handed it to Ruford. The older man examined them, selected the ignition key, and pocketed the rest. "Here's how this works," Ruford said. "You're going to climb up in that cab, start the engine, and follow us back to the farm. Carl's going to ride with you, and if you try anything at all, he's going to put a shell through your spine. Then we go back and start working through the people in the barn until there's nobody left. Understand?" "Yeah," Merle said, his voice flat. Ruford unlocked the rear doors and stepped out. Carl grabbed Merle by the arm and pulled him out into the cold, then used his knife to cut the zip ties. Merle's hands were free for the first time in hours, and he flexed his fingers, feeling the blood rush back painfully. Carl kept the shotgun trained on him as they walked to the Kenworth, and Merle climbed up into the cab with Carl right behind him, settling into the passenger seat with the gun across his lap. Merle took the key Ruford handed through the window, slid it into the ignition, and turned. The engine roared to life, the familiar sound and vibration almost comforting after the nightmare of the last few hours. He let it warm up for a moment, then released the air brake and eased the rig into gear. The van pulled out ahead of him, and Merle followed, his mind racing as he drove. This was his chance, maybe his only one. Once he got the truck back to the farm, once they loaded it with stolen equipment, his value would plummet. He'd be a liability, someone who knew too much and had already proven he could drive their cargo. Ruford would keep him alive long enough to make the delivery, and then Merle would join the others under those tarps. He couldn't let that happen. But Carl was watching him, the shotgun ready, and the van ahead was close enough that any sudden move would be noticed immediately. Merle's hands gripped the wheel, his mind cycling through options. He could swerve, try to force the van off the road, but that would likely get him killed and wouldn't help the others back at the barn. He could try to overpower Carl, but the younger man was alert and armed, and Merle was still weak from the blow to his head. No, he needed to be smarter than that, needed to wait for the right moment, the right opening, and in the meantime, he needed to stay alive and keep his eyes open. Because somewhere in this nightmare, there had to be a weakness, a flaw in Ruford's operation that Merle could exploit. He just had to find it before it was too late. They turned off the county road onto the gravel path that led back to the farm, the van's taillights bobbing ahead of them. Merle downshifted, letting the engine slow the rig on the rough terrain, and scanned the darkness around them. The trees pressed in close on both sides, their branches heavy with snow, and somewhere in the distance he heard the sound of dogs barking. Ruford's dogs, the ones Carl had mentioned. Another layer of security, another obstacle to escape. The farm came into view, the building's dark shapes against the starlit sky. Ruford pulled the van into the clearing and got out, gesturing for Merle to park the rig next to the barn. Merle complied, maneuvering the Kenworth into position, and killed the engine. Carl kept the shotgun on him as they climbed down, and Ruford was waiting, flanked now by Eudora, who'd emerged from one of the outbuildings. "Good," Ruford said. "No problems. I like that." He looked at Eudora. "Get him some food and water. I need him strong enough to drive tomorrow. After that, we'll see." Eudora nodded and gestured for Merle to follow. Carl stayed close behind as they walked to the main house, a 2-story structure with boarded windows and a sagging porch. Inside, the house was warmer than the barn, but not by much. Heated by a wood stove that glowed in the corner of what had once been a living room. There was a card table with mismatched chairs, a sofa with the stuffing coming out, and a few sleeping bags rolled up against the wall. Eudora pointed to one of the chairs. "Sit." Merle sat, and she disappeared into what he assumed was the kitchen, returning a few minutes later with a plate of cold sandwiches and a bottle of water. She set them in front of him and stood back, arms crossed, watching as he ate. The food was tasteless, the bread stale and the meat questionable. But Merle forced it down. He needed the calories, needed the strength. "You were a nurse," Merle said between bites, keeping his voice conversational. "How'd you end up here?" Eudora's expression didn't change. "That's not your business." "Maybe not," Merle said. "But I'm curious. You don't strike me as someone who'd choose this life." She was silent for a long moment, and Merle thought she wouldn't answer. Then she sighed, a sound that was almost weary. "I made a mistake," she said quietly. "Got involved with the wrong people, tried to help someone I shouldn't have. Things went bad, and I ended up owing money I couldn't pay. Ruford offered me a way out, said if I worked for him the debt would be cleared. That was 5 years ago. And now you're trapped," Merle said. "Now I'm alive," Eudora corrected. "Which is more than I can say for the people who came looking for that debt." She turned away, her shoulders tight. "Eat your food. You'll need it tomorrow." Merle finished the sandwich in silence, washing it down with the water. When he was done, Carl led him back to the barn, chain him again, and shove him back into the corner with the others. The door closed, the padlock clicked, and Merle was left alone with his thoughts and the cold and the knowledge that tomorrow, one way or another, things were going to come to a head. Harold leaned close, his voice barely audible. "You get a look around? See anything useful?" "Dogs," Merle said. "At least 2, maybe more, and the main house has a wood stove, which means there's a chimney, maybe a way out through the roof if we could get inside." He paused, thinking. Ruford's confident, maybe too confident. He's been doing this long enough that he's gotten comfortable, and comfortable people make mistakes. "What kind of mistakes?" Harold asked. "The kind that might keep us alive," Merle said. "But I'm going to need your help, all of you." He looked around at the other captives, at their exhausted faces and hollow eyes, and saw something flicker there. Not hope, exactly, but something close to it. The faint possibility that maybe, just maybe, they weren't dead yet. And in the darkness of that freezing barn, with the wind howling outside and danger pressing in from all sides, Merle Thatcher began to plan. Morning came gray and bitter, light filtering through the gaps in the barn walls like smoke. Merle hadn't slept, had spent the night running through scenarios in his mind, discarding most of them as too risky or too dependent on variables he couldn't control. But he'd settled on something, a plan that was half-formed and dangerous, but better than waiting passively for death. He'd shared the basics with Harold and the others, speaking in whispers that barely carried across the frozen air, and seen the same desperate calculation in their eyes. They knew the odds. They knew what would happen if they failed. But doing nothing guaranteed the same outcome, just slower. The barn door opened and Ruford entered with Carl and Eudora. The older man looked rested, almost cheerful, like this was just another day of business. He crossed to where the captives sat and gestured to Merle. Up, time to load the truck. Carl unlocked the chains, and Merle stood, his joints stiff and aching. They led him outside, where his Kenworth sat covered in a fresh dusting of snow. Behind it, parked near one of the outbuildings, was a flatbed trailer loaded with equipment. Generators, compressors, lengths of pipe, all of it marked with company logos that Merle recognized from job sites across the state. Stolen, just like Harold had said. "You're going to hook up that trailer," Ruford said, pointing. "Then you're going to drive it to an address I give you in Montana. Delivery's expected tomorrow morning. You make it on time, you drop the load, and you come back here. Do that, and maybe we talk about letting you go." Merle knew it was a lie. Ruford had no intention of letting him go, not after what he'd seen, not after what he knew. But he nodded anyway, playing along. "All right, I'll need the trailer hitch adjusted. That flatbed's not going to line up with my fifth wheel without some work." Ruford considered this, then nodded to Carl. "Help him, but keep your eyes on him. He tries anything, you know what to do." Carl raised the shotgun slightly, a reminder, and followed Merle to the truck. Merle climbed into the cab, started the engine, and began the process of backing up to the trailer. It was delicate work, requiring precision and patience, and Carl stood watching from a safe distance, the gun never wavering. Merle took his time, adjusting the angle, creeping backward inch by inch, and all the while his mind was racing, looking for an opening. It came when Ruford walked over to inspect the hitch connection, his attention focused on the coupling mechanism. Merle was in the cab, hands on the wheel, engine idling. Carl was to his right, between the truck and the barn, shotgun lowered slightly as he leaned forward to hear what Ruford was saying. The distance between them was maybe 15 feet. Not much, but enough. Merle didn't hesitate. He dropped the transmission into reverse and hit the accelerator. The truck lurched backward, the trailer hitch slamming into the flatbed with a metallic crash that echoed across the clearing. Ruford dove to the side, cursing, and Carl spun around, raising the shotgun. But Merle was already shifting into first, yanking the wheel hard to the left. The Kenworth's rear end swung out, the trailer jackknifing, and the whole assembly swept across the space where Carl was standing. The younger man tried to jump back, but the trailer clipped him, sending him sprawling into the snow. The shotgun went off, the blast deafening, pellets pinging off the side of the truck. Merle didn't wait to see if Carl was down for good. He floored the accelerator, the rig lurching forward, tires spinning on the frozen ground before finding purchase. He aimed for the gravel road that led out of the clearing, the same route they'd used to bring him here, and prayed the rig would hold together long enough to get him clear. Behind him, he heard shouting, the sound of doors slamming. In his mirror, he saw Ruford running toward the van, Eudora right behind him. The dogs were barking now, a frenzied chorus that sent adrenaline spiking through Merle's veins. He shifted up through the gears, the engine roaring, the trailer still attached but swinging wildly behind him. He didn't have time to unhook it, didn't have time for anything except getting as much distance as possible between himself and that farm. The gravel road was rough, rutted from freeze-thaw cycles, and the rig bounced violently, the suspension groaning. Merle fought the wheel, keeping the truck centered as best he could, his eyes flicking between the road ahead and the mirrors. The van appeared behind him, closing fast, and he saw Ruford in the driver's seat, face twisted with rage. The passenger window rolled down, and Eudora leaned out, something in her hands. A pistol. The first shot went wide, punching through the air beside the truck. The second hit the trailer, sparking off metal. Merle swerved, the rig fishtailing, and nearly lost control. He corrected, hands white-knuckled on the wheel, and pushed the accelerator harder. The Kenworth wasn't built for speed, especially not with a loaded trailer, but it was heavier than the van, and that gave him an advantage if he could use it. The road curved ahead, following the tree line, and Merle took it wide, using the full width of the gravel. The van tried to pull alongside to get a better angle, but Merle drifted right, forcing it toward the ditch. Ruford swerved to avoid going over, losing ground, and Merle gained a few precious seconds. Enough to see the county road ahead, the intersection where gravel met pavement. He didn't slow down. He hit the intersection at 40 miles an hour. The trailer swinging out behind him like a pendulum, and felt the whole rig shudder as it transitioned from gravel to asphalt. The tires screamed, fighting for grip, and for a heart-stopping moment Merle thought the trailer was going to flip, taking the truck with it. But the weight held, the physics worked in his favor, and the rig straightened out, surging forward onto the empty highway. The van followed, but it was slower now, losing ground with every second. Merle shifted up, pushing the Kenworth to 60, then 65. The engine howled, the trailer rattled, and warning lights began flickering on the dashboard. He ignored them. All that mattered was distance. Getting far enough away that Ruford couldn't catch him, that he could find help, call the police, get back to the others before it was too late. But then he remembered. The others. Harold, Anita, Rick, Paul. They were still back there, still chained in that barn, and if Merle didn't come back, Ruford would take his anger out on them. Merle's hands tightened on the wheel, his mind tearing itself apart with the decision. Keep running, save himself, or go back and try to save them all. The choice was made for him when he saw the roadblock ahead. Two vehicles pulled across both lanes, headlights on, the silhouette of figures standing behind them. Merle's first instinct was to brake, but something made him hesitate. The vehicles were wrong. Not police cruisers, not highway patrol. A pickup and a sedan, arranged just like the fake accident scene that had lured him in the first place. More of Ruford's people. He'd called ahead, set another trap, and Merle was driving straight into it. He slammed on the brakes, the rig shuddering, air brakes screaming. The trailer jackknifed again, swinging out to the left, and Merle fought to keep the truck from tipping. The Kenworth slewed sideways, tires smoking, and came to a stop angled across both lanes. In his mirror, he saw the van skidding to a halt behind him, Ruford and Eudora jumping out. Trapped, front and back, nowhere to go. Merle looked at the doors, at the windows, calculating how long he had before they reached him. Not long. Seconds, maybe. He grabbed the CB mic, keyed it, and shouted into the static. "Mayday! Mayday! This is a driver in distress on County Road 47, south of Harvey. Armed hostiles, multiple captives. Anybody copy?" Nothing. Just the hiss of empty channels. He tried again, cycling through frequencies, his voice raw with desperation. And then, impossibly, a voice crackled back. "Copy that, driver. This is North Dakota Highway Patrol. Stay in your vehicle. Units are en route. ETA 6 minutes. 6 minutes? It might as well have been 6 hours. Ruford was at the driver's door now, pounding on it, shouting for Merle to get out. Merle locked the door, backed away toward the sleeper, his eyes searching for anything he could use as a weapon. The maglite was gone, lost somewhere in the chaos. All he had were his hands and the shrinking seconds on the clock. The window exploded inward, glass spraying across the cab. Eudora stood on the step, the pistol in her hand, barrel pointed at Merle's chest. "Out," she said, her voice cold and flat. "Now." Merle raised his hands, moving slowly, and climbed down from the cab. Ruford grabbed him by the collar, slammed him against the side of the truck. "You just killed those people back at the farm," Ruford snarled. "You know that? Whatever happens to them, it's on you." "Then we'd better hurry, Merle," said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Because the highway patrol's on its way, and when they get here, you're done." Ruford's eyes narrowed, searching Merle's face for the lie, and for a moment, Merle thought the man might call his bluff. But then they heard it. Sirens, distant but growing closer, the wail cutting through the morning air like a knife. Ruford's expression shifted, calculation replacing rage, and he stepped back, releasing Merle. "Get in the van," he snapped at Eudora. "We're leaving." "What about him?" she asked, gesturing at Merle. "Leave him. He's not worth it anymore." They ran for the van, the figures at the roadblock already scattering, their vehicles pulling away in different directions. The van's engine roared to life, and it spun in a tight U-turn, kicking up gravel as it sped back the way it had come. Merle watched them go, his legs shaking, adrenaline crashing through his system. Then he turned and started running toward the roadblock, toward the flashing lights that were cresting the hill in the distance. The highway patrol cruisers arrived 3 minutes later, 2 of them, lights blazing. Troopers poured out, weapons drawn, and Merle raised his hands, shouting over the noise. "The farm! There are people being held at a farm about 5 miles back. They need help now." The senior trooper, a woman with sharp eyes and gray streaks in her hair, lowered her weapon and stepped forward. "You the one who called it in?" "Yeah. They've got at least 4 captives, maybe more. Armed suspects, multiple vehicles. They're running, but if you move fast, you can cut them off." She didn't waste time with questions, just turned and barked orders into her radio. Within minutes, more units were arriving, and Merle was being loaded into the back of a cruiser, wrapped in a blanket someone had pulled from a trunk. The troopers coordinated a response, half of them heading toward the farm, the others setting up roadblocks on every route out of the area. Merle sat in the back of the cruiser, watching through the window as they worked, and felt something inside him finally unclench. He'd done it. He'd gotten out, called for help, and now, maybe, just maybe, the others would too. The rescue operation took 4 hours. By the time the troopers cleared the farm, they'd arrested Carl, who'd been left behind with a broken leg from where the trailer had hit him. Ruford and Eudora had tried to flee on foot through the woods, but the dogs they'd used to keep captives in line turned on them when the troopers arrived, and they were taken into custody without further incident. The 4 captives in the barn were found alive, malnourished and traumatized but breathing, and transported to a hospital in Fargo. Merle gave his statement from a hospital bed, his head wound stitched and bandaged, his body slowly warming under heated blankets. The detectives who interviewed him were thorough, and when they were done, they told him he'd likely be called to testify. He said he'd be there, whatever it took to make sure Ruford and his people never did this again. 3 weeks later, Merle was back on the road, hauling a load of auto parts from Minnesota to Montana. Same route, same highway. But this time, when he saw a car on the shoulder with its hazards on, he didn't stop. He radioed it in, gave the dispatcher the location, and kept driving. Let the highway patrol handle it. Let someone with backup and a badge take the risk. Because he'd learned something in that barn, something that sat heavy in his chest every time he thought about it. The road was full of traps, some obvious, some hidden, and the only way to survive was to stay alert, stay suspicious, and never, ever assume that someone asking for help was telling the truth. Harold called him once, a month after the arrests. They talked for a while, traded updates on their recoveries, and made vague promises to stay in touch. But Merle knew they wouldn't. Survivors didn't like being reminded of what they'd survived. It was easier to move on, to pretend the nightmare had happened to someone else. Merle still drives that route through North Dakota, still passes the county road where he'd been taken. Sometimes he slows down, looks at the trees and the empty fields, and wonders if there are other farms out there. Other Roofords running their operations in the dark spaces between towns. He doesn't know, doesn't want to know. All he knows is that when he parks for the night now, he chooses truck stops with cameras and other drivers nearby. He locks his doors, checks his mirrors, and sleeps with one hand on his keys, because out here in the cold and the dark and the endless miles, trust is a luxury he can't afford anymore. And every time he sees flares on the road, every time a stranger waves him down, he remembers the woman who wasn't a victim, the man who wasn't injured, and the van full of secrets that nearly cost him everything. He remembers, and he keeps driving. Clem Redding had been driving through Wyoming's high plains for 16 years, and he'd always thought of the landscape as honest. Brutal, yes, but honest. The wind didn't hide what it was doing. The cold didn't pretend to be something gentler, and the storms came at you head-on instead of sneaking up from behind. It was a place that demanded respect, and Clem had always given it. But respect only went so far when the weather turned wrong and the road disappeared beneath you. And that's exactly what happened on the third week of January 2017. He'd been hauling drilling components from Casper to Rock Springs, a run he'd done maybe 40 times before. The forecast had called for light snow, nothing the highways couldn't handle, and Clem had left just after noon with a full tank and clear skies. By the time he crossed into the basin country west of Rawlins, the light snow had become something else entirely. Thick flakes that came down like wet cement, piling up faster than the wipers could clear them, and wind that hit the trailer broadside hard enough to make the whole rig shudder. He'd considered pulling over, waiting it out at one of the rest areas along I-80, but the CB chatter had been full of reports about accidents and closures further west. If he stopped now, he might be stuck for days, and the load he was carrying was time-sensitive. The drilling company had been explicit about the delivery window. Miss it, and Clem would be looking at penalties he couldn't afford. So he'd kept driving, kept his speed down to 40, and trusted that the road would stay where it was supposed to be. That trust lasted until mile marker 187, when the highway just stopped existing. Not literally, not in the sense that it crumbled away or got washed out, but the snow had gotten so deep and the visibility so poor that Clem couldn't tell where the pavement ended and the shoulder began. The lane markers were buried, the reflectors invisible, and the world outside his windshield had turned into a featureless expanse of white that stretched in every direction. He eased off the throttle, letting the rig slow naturally, and tried the CB again. Westbound traffic on I-80. This is a Peterbilt near mile 187 requesting road conditions. Visibility's down to nothing out here. Anybody got eyes further ahead? Static answered him, the same empty hiss that had been his only companion for the last 30 miles. He adjusted the squelch, cycled through channels, but every frequency was dead. Not unusual in this part of Wyoming, where the terrain swallowed radio signals like they were nothing, but still unsettling. Clem had driven through plenty of storms alone, but there was something about this one that felt different, heavier, more isolated. He checked his GPS, but the screen showed only a blinking cursor on a white background, the map data failing to load. His phone had lost signal an hour ago, somewhere past Rawlins, and the battery was down to 15%. He turned it off to conserve power, though he wasn't sure what good it would do him. Out here, in the middle of the basin with nothing but sage and snow for 100 miles in any direction, a dead phone was just dead weight. The fuel gauge caught his eye, just under half a tank. Not critical, but closer to the line than Clem liked. He'd planned to refuel in Rock Springs, but Rock Springs was still 80 miles west, and at the pace he was crawling, it might take 3 or 4 hours to get there. Maybe longer if the storm didn't let up. He did the math in his head, factoring in the engine load, the wind resistance, the constant work the heater was doing to keep the cab warm. He could make it, probably. But probably was a word that had gotten more than one driver killed out here. The road curved slightly to the left, following the natural contour of the land, and Clem eased into the turn, feeling the trailer slide just a fraction before the tires caught. His hands stayed loose on the wheel, not fighting the movement, just guiding it. Fighting a slide was how you ended up in the ditch, and out here, the ditch meant waiting for a tow that might not come for hours, maybe days. He straightened out, kept his eyes locked on the faint impression of the road ahead, and tried not to think about how alone he was. Then the voice came through the radio, faint and distorted, barely audible over the static. Eastbound traffic. If you can hear this, turn back. Road's closed ahead. Clem grabbed the CB mic, keyed it. Say again. This is westbound at mile 187. You're breaking up. The voice came again, clearer this time, but still wrapped in interference. Road's closed. Jackknifed, semi-blocking both lanes. Turn around if you can. Clem felt his chest tighten. Turning around meant backtracking 50 miles to the last exit, and there was no guarantee that route would be any better. But pushing forward into a blocked highway meant getting stuck behind the accident, burning fuel while he waited for it to clear. Neither option was good. He keyed the mic again. Copy that. What's your 20? Are you with Highway Patrol? Static, just static. Clem tried again, asking for clarification, for confirmation, but the voice didn't come back. He sat there for a moment, engine idling, trying to decide. The smart move was to turn around, to backtrack and take his chances on an alternate route. But something about the voice bothered him. It had sounded wrong, not in any specific way he could point to, but wrong like a note played slightly off-key. And if the road really was blocked, where was the traffic? Where were the other trucks backed up behind the accident? He looked in his mirrors, at the empty highway stretching behind him, and made his decision. He'd keep going, but slow, cautious, ready to stop if he saw anything that looked like trouble. If the road was blocked, he'd deal with it when he got there. And if the voice had been wrong, or if he'd misheard it through the static, then he'd just wasted a few minutes of fuel. Better that than turning around for nothing. The miles crawled by, each one identical to the last. White sky, white ground, the dividing line between them erased by the storm. Clem's eyes ached from straining to see, from searching for landmarks or road signs that weren't there, and the tension in his shoulders had turned into a steady throb that ran down his spine. He shifted in his seat, trying to ease the pressure, and that's when he noticed the sound. It was coming from the radio, a low-frequency hum that rose and fell like breathing. Not static, not the normal white noise of an empty channel, but something rhythmic and deliberate. Clem turned the volume down, but the hum didn't change. He switched channels, and the hum followed, staying constant no matter where he tuned. He turned the radio off completely, and the hum stopped. When he turned it back on, the hum returned, louder now, almost like it was getting closer. Clem felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He told himself it was interference, just the storm playing tricks with the frequencies, but the rational explanation didn't make the sound any less unsettling. He turned the radio off again and left it off, driving in silence except for the wind and the engine and the whisper of snow against glass. The quiet should have been a relief, but instead it felt oppressive, like the absence of sound was its own kind of pressure. Mile marker 195 appeared briefly through the snow, then vanished. Clem marked it mentally, calculating the distance to Rock Springs. 72 miles. Still manageable, as long as nothing else went wrong, but things had a way of going wrong out here, especially when you started thinking they wouldn't. He'd seen it happen to other drivers, watch them get complacent or overconfident, and then watch them pay for it when the road turned on them. He was so focused on the white ahead that he almost missed the shape beside the road. It was there for just a second, a dark, vertical line against the snow, and then it was gone. Clem hit the brakes, the rig slowing, and stared into his mirror. Nothing, just empty road and falling snow. He told himself it had been a post or a sign, something solid and explainable, but the shape had been too tall, too narrow, and it had seemed to move, to turn as he passed. "You're seeing things," Clem muttered to himself, the sound of his own voice startling in the quiet cab. "Storm's getting to you." But when he looked forward again, he saw it. Another shape, this one on the opposite side of the road. Same height, same posture. And as he approached, it did move, stepping back from the shoulder and fading into the white. Clem's hands tightened on the wheel. He told himself to keep driving, to ignore it, but his foot was already easing off the accelerator, the rig slowing to a crawl. The shapes appeared again, 2 of them now, standing together on the shoulder like they were waiting for something. Clem stared at them as he passed, trying to make out details, but the snow obscured everything except their silhouettes. Tall, human-shaped, but wrong in a way he couldn't define. Their proportions were off, arms too long, heads tilted at angles that didn't look natural, and they didn't move when he passed, didn't wave or call out, just stood there watching. Clem accelerated, the engine roaring as the rig picked up speed. He didn't care about caution anymore, didn't care about conserving fuel or keeping his distance from the vehicle ahead. He just wanted to put as much space as possible between himself and those shapes. The speedometer climbed to 50, then 55, the trailer swaying as the wind caught it. Too fast for conditions, way too fast. But Clem couldn't make himself slow down. The radio crackled to life without him touching it, the hum returning but different now. Words were buried in it, voices speaking in overlapping layers that Clem couldn't separate. He caught fragments, pieces of sentences that didn't connect. Lost in the white. Can't find the road. How long have I been driving? The voices were distorted, some male, some female, all of them tinged with the same desperate confusion. Clem reached for the radio to turn it off, but before his hand reached the dial, one voice cut through the others, clear and distinct. "Clem Redding, you're going the wrong way." He jerked his hand back like the radio had burned him. The voice knew his name. Somehow, impossibly, the voice knew his name. He stared at the radio, at the green glow of the channel indicator, and felt ice settle into his chest. "Who is this?" he said aloud, not keying the mic, just speaking into the cab. The voice didn't answer. The hum continued, the overlapping fragments cycling through the same phrases, and underneath it all, Clem thought he could hear something else. Laughter, maybe, or crying. He couldn't tell which. He grabbed the radio and yanked it from its mount, the wires tearing free with a spark. The sound cut off immediately, leaving only silence. Clem threw the radio onto the passenger seat and focused on the road. His heart was pounding, his breath coming in short gasps, and he forced himself to slow down, to think rationally. The storm was messing with his head, that's all. The isolation, the stress, the hours of staring into white nothingness had created an opening for his mind to start playing tricks. The shapes were snowdrifts, the voices were interference, and the fact that one of them had used his name was just a coincidence, a fragment of a CB conversation bleeding through the static. He almost believed it. Would have believed it, if not for what he saw next. Ahead, barely visible through the snow, was a truck. It was parked sideways across both lanes, blocking the road exactly like the voice had warned. Clem hit the brakes, the rig shuddering as the wheels locked and released, ABS kicking in. He came to a stop maybe 30 feet from the truck, close enough to see that it was another Peterbilt, older model, with Oklahoma plates and a cargo trailer that looked identical to his own. The truck's lights were off, engine silent, and there was no one in the cab that Clem could see. He sat there, staring at it, trying to make sense of what he was looking at. If this was the jackknifed semi the voice had mentioned, why wasn't there anyone around it? No highway patrol, no tow trucks, no other drivers waiting for the road to clear. Just the truck sitting alone in the middle of the highway like it had been abandoned. Clem reached for his coat, intending to step out and investigate, but something stopped him. A feeling, more instinct than thought, that getting out of the cab would be a mistake. He looked at the truck again, at the way it sat perfectly centered across both lanes, and realized that it wasn't blocking the road because of an accident. It was blocking the road on purpose, like it was waiting, like it wanted him to stop. He put the rig in reverse and started backing up, eyes locked on the abandoned truck. As he moved, he saw the driver's door open, slow and deliberate, and a figure stepped out. It was too far to see clearly, but Clem could make out the shape, tall and dark against the snow, and the way it turned toward him, tracking his movement. Then it started walking, not fast, but steady, closing the distance between them. Clem slammed the transmission into first and yanked the wheel, pulling the rig into a tight turn. The trailer swung out, tires screaming, and for a moment he thought it was going to jackknife, dump him into the ditch. But the wheels held, and the rig straightened out, facing back the way he'd come. He floored the accelerator, and the Peterbilt surged forward, leaving the abandoned truck and its silent driver behind. He didn't know where he was going anymore. Didn't know if he was heading east or west, if he was still on the highway or had drifted onto some side road that would lead him deeper into the white. All he knew was that he had to keep moving, had to put distance between himself and whatever was out there in the storm, because something was wrong with this place, wrong in a way that went beyond bad weather and poor visibility. And as the miles disappeared beneath his wheels and the fuel gauge crept lower, Clem Redding began to understand that he might not find his way out before the tank ran dry. Clem drove for what felt like hours, but might have been minutes. Time had stopped making sense, the way it always did when every direction looked the same, and the only constant was the engine's rumble beneath him. The fuel gauge had dropped to a quarter tank, the needle hovering just above the red zone, and Clem's hands ached from gripping the wheel so tight. He forced himself to relax, to breathe, but the tension just migrated to his jaw, his shoulders, settling in like it planned to stay. The road, or what he thought was the road, had narrowed. The shoulder had disappeared entirely, swallowed by drifts that rose higher than his door handles. If he veered off now, even a few feet, the rig would be buried to the axles and he'd be stuck until spring. The thought made his chest tighten, made it harder to breathe, and he pushed it away. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. Panic got people killed. He checked the mirrors again, a habit so ingrained he didn't even think about it anymore, and saw only white. No abandoned truck following him, no dark figures emerging from the snow. Whatever he'd seen back there, it hadn't pursued him. Or maybe it didn't need to. Maybe it knew he was already lost, already circling deeper into the storm with no way out. The thought settled in his mind like a stone, heavy and cold, and he couldn't shake it loose. The CB radio, still disconnected and lying on the passenger seat, crackled to life. Clem's head snapped toward it, his heart jumping. The wires were torn, the power cable dangling uselessly, but the speaker was emitting sound anyway. That same low hum rising and falling, and underneath it, voices. More of them now, a dozen or more, all talking over each other in a chaos of static and words. Been driving for days. Road doesn't end. Running out of fuel. Can anyone hear me? Clem reached over and grabbed the radio, shaking it like that would somehow make it stop. The voices continued, indifferent to his panic. He threw it toward the back of the cab, heard it clatter against the sleeper wall, but the sound didn't stop. It was coming from everywhere now, from the dashboard, from the door panels, from the air itself. Clem slammed his palms over his ears, but the voices bled through anyway, seeping into his skull like water through cracks. And then, cutting through all of it, clear and calm, came a woman's voice. "Clem Redding, this is dispatch. Do you copy?" Clem dropped his hands, staring at the empty space where the radio had been mounted. "Dispatch?" His voice came out hoarse, rough from hours of silence. "Who is this?" "This is Ione Carver with Wyoming Highway Operations. We've been trying to reach you for the last 30 minutes. Your GPS signal dropped, and we lost contact. What's your current location?" Relief flooded through Clem so suddenly it made him dizzy. Real contact, a real person, someone who could help. "I don't know," he said quickly. "I was westbound on I-80 past Rollins, but I lost visibility and the road markers are gone. I think I'm still on the interstate, but I can't be sure. Fuel's low, maybe 70 miles of range left." Static filled the pause, and for a moment Clem thought the connection had been lost. Then the voice came back, still calm, but with an edge of concern. "Copy that. We're showing severe weather across the entire basin. All units are engaged with accidents and closures. I'm going to try to triangulate your position, but I need you to stay on this frequency. Can you do that?" "Yes," Clem said. "Yes, I'm here." "Good. Keep driving, maintain your current heading. I'll guide you to the nearest safe location. Just stay with me, Clem." He nodded, even though she couldn't see him, and focused on the road. The woman's voice, Ione Carver, continued speaking, asking questions about his speed, his fuel consumption, the condition of his rig. Clem answered as best he could, grateful for the distraction, for the sound of another human voice cutting through the isolation. It anchored him, gave him something to hold on to besides the fear that had been building since he'd seen those shapes on the shoulder. "Ione," he said after a few minutes. "Before you reached me, I was getting strange interference on the radio. Voices, like other drivers calling for help, and something else, something that knew my name." Silence. Then, "Atmospheric conditions can cause unusual radio phenomena. Solar flares, ionospheric disturbances. It's rare, but it happens. The storm might be amplifying local transmissions, bouncing them back in strange ways." It was a reasonable explanation, logical and grounded in science. Clem wanted to believe it. But it didn't explain how the radio had worked without power, didn't explain the abandoned truck or the figures in the snow. He opened his mouth to press the issue, but Ione spoke first. "Clem, I need you to listen carefully. There's a highway patrol checkpoint about 40 miles ahead of you at mile marker 220. Officer Ward Hollister is stationed there, managing traffic through the worst of the storm. If you can reach him, he'll be able to assist you. But you need to conserve fuel. Drop your speed to 35 and maintain steady throttle. Can you do that?" "Yeah," Clem said, easing off the accelerator. The speedometer dropped, settling at 35, and the engine's pitch lowered to a steady drone. "How long till I reach the checkpoint?" "At your current speed, Approximately 70 minutes. I'll stay on the line with you the entire time. 70 minutes. Clem did the math, factoring in the fuel consumption at reduced speed. It would be close, dangerously close, but possible. He could make it. He had to make it. Copy that. I'm holding steady. The miles crept by, each one marked only by the slow rotation of the odometer. Clem kept his eyes on the road, searching for any sign of the checkpoint, but the white remained unbroken. Ione's voice filled the silence, asking questions, offering reassurance, and Clem answered mechanically, his attention split between her words and the dwindling fuel gauge. A quarter tank had become an eighth, the needle now firmly in the red zone. "Ione," Clem said, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. "Fuel's lower than I thought. I don't know if I'm going to make it." "You're going to make it, Clem. Officer Hollister is expecting you, just a little further." But the reassurance felt hollow now, scripted, and something about Ione's tone had changed. It was still calm, still measured, but there was a flatness to it, a lack of inflection that made it sound almost mechanical. Clem frowned, listening more carefully. "Ione, how long have you been on dispatch tonight?" A pause, longer than it should have been. "I've been here for quite some time, Clem, helping drivers just like you." "How many drivers have you helped tonight?" "Many? Too many to count." The answer sent a chill down Clem's spine. Too many to count. Real dispatchers didn't talk like that. They kept logs, tracked calls, knew exactly how many units they'd contacted and where. He glanced at the torn radio on the floor of the cab, at the disconnected wires, and felt his chest tighten. If the radio wasn't connected, if it had no power, then who was he talking to? "Ione," he said carefully. "What's your call sign? Your official dispatch identifier?" Silence. The kind that stretched and pulled, filling the cab with its weight. Then the voice came back, and it wasn't Ione anymore. It was something else, layered and distorted, a dozen voices speaking in unison. "You're lost, Clem. You've been lost for hours. There is no checkpoint. There is no Officer Hollister. There's only the white, and you'll drive until the fuel runs out, and then you'll walk until the cold takes you. Just like the others." Clem's blood ran cold. He grabbed the phantom radio, shaking it again, but the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, overlapping, merging into a sound that was almost like laughter. He threw it against the windshield, heard the plastic crack, and the sound cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was worse than the voices had been, oppressive and complete. He looked at the fuel gauge. The needle was below the empty line now, the engine running on fumes. He had maybe 10 miles left, maybe less, and ahead of him, through the snow, he saw something, a shape, dark and angular, rising out of the white. His heart leaped. A building, it had to be a building. Clem pushed the accelerator, coaxing the last bit of speed from the dying engine. The shape grew larger, resolving into the outline of a structure. Not a checkpoint, not a patrol station, but a building nonetheless. Old, weathered, with a peaked roof half collapsed under the weight of snow. It looked abandoned, forgotten, but it was shelter. And right now, shelter was the only thing that mattered. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. The rig coasted forward on momentum alone, slowing gradually as the distance to the building shrank. Clem steered toward it, praying the wheels would carry him close enough to reach it on foot. 50 feet, 40, 30. The rig rolled to a stop 20 feet from the entrance, and Clem sat there for a moment, staring at the structure through the windshield. It was a gas station, or had been once. The pumps were gone, torn out or buried under snow, but the canopy was still intact, and through the frost-covered windows he could see the interior. Dark, empty, but enclosed. Out of the wind. Out of the snow. He grabbed his coat, his gloves, and the maglite from the door pocket, and stepped down from the cab. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and burning his exposed skin. He ducked his head against the wind and ran for the building, boots slipping on ice, nearly going down twice before he reached the door. It was locked, the handle frozen solid, but the window next to it was cracked. Clem used the maglite to knock out the remaining glass, cleared the frame, and climbed through. Inside, the air was still cold, but without the wind it felt almost warm by comparison. Clem shone the flashlight around, taking in the space. Shelves lined the walls, most of them empty or collapsed. A counter sat near the back, covered in dust and debris. There was a door behind it, partially open, leading into darkness, and in the center of the room, sitting on the floor like it had been waiting for him, was another CB radio. Clem approached it slowly, the beam of his flashlight trembling. The radio was old, ancient even, with vacuum tubes instead of transistors and a hand crank on the side. But it was intact, and when he knelt beside it and turned the dial, static hissed from the speaker. He cranked the handle, generating power, and the static cleared, replaced by that familiar hum. And then, impossibly, a voice. Clear and close, like the speaker was standing right behind him. "Hello, Clem. We've been waiting for you." He spun around, flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there, just shadows and dust, and the wind howling outside. Clem turned back to the radio, his hand hovering over the dial. He should smash it, destroy it, cut off whatever connection was being made, but he didn't. Because somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion and the cold, a part of him needed to know, needed to understand what was happening. He picked up the microphone, keyed it, and spoke into the void. "Who are you?" The voice that answered wasn't Ione, wasn't the overlapping chorus from before. It was singular, calm, and terrifyingly familiar. It was his own voice, speaking back to him from the static. "I'm you, Clem, the part you left behind when you started driving, the part that's been out here, in the white, waiting to come home." Clem dropped the microphone, stumbling backward. His flashlight fell from his hand, rolled across the floor, and went out. Darkness swallowed the room, and in that darkness he heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the door behind the counter, coming closer. Clem scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the dusty floor, and his hand found the flashlight. He slapped it against his palm, once, twice, and the bulb flickered back to life. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the doorway behind the counter. Empty. No figure, no footsteps, just a black rectangle leading into what looked like a storage room or office. But Clem had heard something. He knew he had. He stood slowly, every muscle in his body coiled tight, ready to run or fight, though he wasn't sure which would do him any good. The radio on the floor continued its low, static hiss, the microphone lying where he'd dropped it. Clem kept the flashlight trained on the doorway as he backed toward the broken window he'd climbed through. The wind outside had picked up again, screaming through the gaps in the building's shell, and snow was beginning to pile up on the sill. "You can't leave, Clem." The voice came from the radio again, still using his own inflection, his own rhythm. "There's nowhere to go. The storm has the highway and the highway has you. It's had you since you passed mile marker 187, maybe longer." Clem's jaw clenched. "I don't know what you are," he said aloud, "but I'm not staying here to find out." "You think you have a choice?" The voice almost sounded amused. "Look outside, Clem, really look." Against his better judgment, Clem turned toward the window. Through the broken glass, he could see his rig sitting where he'd left it, already half buried in fresh snow. But beyond it, where the road should have been, there was nothing. No pavement, no shoulder, no tire tracks leading back the way he'd come. Just an unbroken expanse of white that stretched to the horizon in every direction, like the road had never existed at all. Clem's chest tightened. That wasn't possible. He'd just driven here, had followed the road right up to this building. The tracks should be there, fresh and clear, marking his path. But they were gone, erased, and looking at that emptiness made something fundamental crack inside him. The part of his mind that understood cause and effect, that relied on the world making sense, began to fray at the edges. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "No, that's not right. The road's there. It has to be there." "The road is wherever you need it to be," the voice said. "And right now, you don't need it to be anywhere. You need to rest, Clem. You've been driving for so long. Don't you want to stop?" Clem turned away from the window, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The cold was getting to him, or the isolation, or something else he didn't have a name for. He needed to think, needed to find a way out of this that didn't involve freezing to death in an abandoned gas station while his own voice taunted him from a radio that shouldn't work. He swept the flashlight across the room again, looking for anything useful. A door to the outside, a phone, supplies, anything. Near the back wall, partially hidden behind a collapsed shelf, he saw it. A coat, hanging from a nail. Dark brown, canvas, the kind long-haul truckers wore in the decades before synthetic insulation. Clem approached it slowly, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand. The coat looked old, worn thin at the elbows and collar, but it was intact. And on the breast pocket, stitched in faded thread, was a name. Hollister. Clem's blood ran cold. Ward Hollister, the highway patrol officer Ione had mentioned, the one who was supposed to be waiting at the checkpoint. But this wasn't a patrol jacket, wasn't anything official. This was a trucker's coat, and it had been hanging here long enough to gather dust. He reached out, touched the fabric, and it was stiff with cold, like it had been frozen and thawed too many times. "He stopped here too," the voice said, softer now, almost gentle. "Ward Hollister, 23 years ago, during a storm just like this one. He ran out of fuel, same as you. Found this place, same as you. And when the highway patrol finally found him, weeks later, he was still sitting in his truck, frozen solid, hands on the wheel like he'd never stopped driving." Clem pulled his hand back from the coat. "You're lying." "Am I?" The voice paused, letting the silence stretch. "Check the office, Clem. Through that door behind the counter. See for yourself." Every instinct told Clem to run, to climb back through that window and take his chances in the storm. But the storm had already taken his road, had already erased his path out. And if there was even a chance that the voice was telling the truth, that there was something in that office that could help him understand what was happening, he had to know. He had to see. He moved toward the counter, the flashlight beam leading the way. The door was old, the wood warped and split, and it creaked when he pushed it open. The room beyond was small, barely larger than a closet, with a metal desk shoved against one wall and a filing cabinet in the corner. Papers were scattered across the floor, yellowed with age, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. Clem stepped inside, sweeping the light across the space. On the desk, half buried under more papers, was a logbook. He picked it up, blew the dust off the cover, and opened it. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, dates and times and notes about fuel deliveries and inventory. The last entry was dated February 14th, 1994. The handwriting was neat, precise, and at the bottom of the page, someone had written a single sentence. Storms getting worse. Going to wait it out here. Below that, in different ink, shakier handwriting. Day 3 can't find the road. Radios picking up voices but no one's answering. Getting hard to think. And below that, barely legible. I don't think I'm alone. Clem's hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped the book. He flipped through the remaining pages, but they were blank, pristine, like whoever had been writing in it had simply stopped. Or been stopped. He set the logbook down and looked around the office again, the beam of his flashlight catching on something in the corner. A shape, half hidden behind the filing cabinet. He approached slowly, dread building in his chest, and when he saw what it was, he had to fight to keep from vomiting. A body slumped against the wall, frozen in the same position it had collapsed into decades ago. The face was preserved by the cold, skin pulled tight over bone, eyes sunken but still open, staring at nothing. And on the chest, pinned to the coat, was a badge, Highway Patrol, and beneath it, a name tag, W. Hollister. Clem backed out of the office, his mind reeling. Ward Hollister was real, had been real, but he died here in this building during a storm that had happened 23 years ago. And somehow, impossibly, Ione had known his name, had used it to guide Clem to this place, which meant Ione had never been real either, had never been anything but another voice in the static, leading him deeper into the white. "Now you understand," the voice said from the radio in the main room. "This place, this station, it's a trap, a pocket in the storm where time doesn't move the way it should. Drivers get lost, run out of fuel, find this building thinking it's shelter, and then they never leave, because the storm doesn't let them. It holds them here, in the white, until they become part of it." Clem stumbled back into the main room, his breath visible in harsh clouds. "I'm not staying here. I'm not dying here like him." "You don't have a choice," the voice said. And now it wasn't just his voice anymore. It was layered, multiple voices speaking in unison. Hollister's voice, Ione's voice, the voices of others Clem didn't recognize. "The fuel is gone. The road is gone. There's only the white now, and you're already part of it. Can't you feel it? The cold settling into your bones, the way your thoughts are starting to slow down, the edges of your vision going soft?" Clem shook his head violently, trying to clear it. His fingers were numb inside his gloves, his feet like blocks of ice inside his boots. The cold was deeper now, more penetrating, and his body was starting to shiver uncontrollably. Hypothermia. He was going hypothermic, and if he didn't find warmth soon, he'd end up just like Hollister, another frozen corpse waiting to be found. He looked at his rig through the window. No fuel, no heat, but it was familiar. His space, his cab. Maybe if he could get back to it, wrap himself in the sleeping bag from the berth. He could last until morning. Until someone found him. The Highway Patrol had to be looking for him by now. His dispatcher would have noticed when he stopped checking in. They'd send someone. But even as he thought it, he knew it was a lie. No one was coming. The storm had him, just like it had Hollister, just like it had all the others whose voices filled the radio static. He was alone, stranded in a place that shouldn't exist, and the only question left was how long he could hold out before the cold or the madness took him. "There's another option," the voice said, quieter now, almost conspiratorial. "The others who stayed, who accepted what this place is, they're still here, not alive, not exactly, but not gone either. They're part of the white now, part of the storm. They drive the empty roads, answer the calls on the radio, wait for the next lost driver. You could join them, Clem. You could stop fighting. Let the cold take you, and then you'd never be alone again. You'd have all of us. Clem's vision blurred, tears freezing on his cheeks. He wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all, but he didn't have the energy. His body was shutting down, conserving what little heat remained, and his mind was following suit. It would be so easy to just sit down, to close his eyes, to let it all fade away. No more cold, no more fear, no more endless white. But something in him, some stubborn core of will that had kept him driving through blizzards and breakdowns and loneliness for 16 years, refused to give in. He pushed away from the counter, stumbled toward the window and climbed back through. The wind hit him like a wall, but he pushed into it, forcing his legs to move, his boots to find purchase in the snow. The rig was 20 feet away. Might as well have been 20 miles. Each step was agony, his muscles seizing, his joints locking up. But he kept moving, kept his eyes fixed on the familiar shape of his Peterbilt, and when he finally reached the driver's door, he grabbed the handle and pulled himself up. Inside the cab it was barely warmer than outside, but at least the wind was gone. Clem collapsed into the seat, his entire body shaking, and reached for the sleeping bag in the berth. His fingers were too numb to grip the zipper, so he just pulled it over himself like a blanket and curled into a ball, trying to trap whatever heat his body had left. Through the windshield he could see the gas station, and standing in the doorway, barely visible through the falling snow, was a figure, tall, dark, watching. Clem couldn't tell if it was real or another hallucination, couldn't tell if it mattered anymore. He closed his eyes, feeling the cold seep deeper, and wondered if this was how Hollister had felt in those final moments. Alone, afraid, and too tired to fight anymore. The radio, still somehow connected to whatever frequency controlled this place, crackled to life one more time. And the voice that came through wasn't his own, wasn't Ione's, wasn't Hollister's. It was something else, something older and colder and infinitely patient. Sleep, Clem Redding. The white will take care of you now, just like it took care of all the others, just like it always does. And in the darkness behind his eyelids, Clem heard the sound of engines starting, felt the vibration of trucks pulling out onto roads that didn't exist. A convoy of the lost driving through the white forever, never reaching their destinations, never stopping. And somewhere in that ghostly procession he knew there was a space waiting for him. But he wasn't dead yet. Not quite. And as long as his heart was still beating, there was still a chance. However small, however impossible. He just had to make it to morning. Clem didn't sleep so much as drift in and out of consciousness, each period of awareness shorter than the last. His body had stopped shivering, which he knew from his winter driving training was a bad sign, the worst sign. When hypothermia advanced to the stage where shivering stopped, it meant the body was giving up, conserving its last reserves for the vital organs. Everything else, the limbs, the extremities, the parts that could be sacrificed, were being allowed to freeze. He forced his eyes open, though the effort felt monumental. The windshield was completely frosted over now, a solid sheet of ice that turned the world outside into vague shapes and shadows. He couldn't see the gas station anymore, couldn't see anything except white and gray and the occasional darker blur that might have been a tree or a building, or just his dying brain creating patterns where none existed. His breath was so shallow he could barely see it anymore, just the faintest wisps of condensation that disappeared almost immediately. The sleeping bag had helped, but only for a while. Now it was just a thin barrier between him and the killing cold, and he could feel his core temperature dropping degree by degree. His thoughts were sluggish, disconnected, jumping from one thing to another without logic or reason. He thought about his ex-wife, the one who'd left him after 3 years of marriage because she couldn't handle the long hauls and the weeks of absence. He thought about his first truck, a beat-up Freightliner he'd bought with money borrowed from his father. He thought about a diner in Nebraska where the waitress had known his name and his order without him having to say a word. Random memories, surfacing and sinking like debris in dark water. His mind trying to hold on to something, anything, as it spiraled toward the shutdown. He wondered if this was what dying felt like, this gradual dissolution of self, thoughts scattering like snow in the wind until there was nothing left but the white and the cold and the silence. The radio crackled, and through the static came a voice. Different from before, clearer, with an accent Clem recognized as rural Wyoming. "Breaker, breaker. This is westbound traffic at mile marker 223. Anyone out there got their ears on? Road conditions are getting nasty and I could use some company on the line." Clem's eyes focused slightly. That was a real CB call, the kind truckers made all the time when they were driving through lonely stretches and wanted someone to talk to. He tried to reach for the radio, but his hand wouldn't move. The muscles wouldn't respond, and after a moment he gave up, letting his arm drop back to his side. It didn't matter anyway. His radio was torn from the dash, useless, and even if it had been working, he didn't have the strength to key the mic. "Anybody copy?" the voice continued. "This is a Kenworth hauling westbound, and I'm starting to think I'm the only fool out here tonight." Another voice answered, this one female, younger. "Copy that, westbound. This is an eastbound Volvo about 10 miles ahead of you. Storm's bad but manageable if you keep your speed down. What's your cargo?" "Drilling equipment out of Casper. You?" "Produce from Idaho. Lettuce and tomatoes, if you can believe it. Going to feel real stupid if I wreck this rig over a load of salad." The first driver chuckled, the sound warm and human, and so achingly normal that Clem felt something inside his chest crack. This was what he'd been missing, what the white had taken from him. Connection. The simple act of two drivers sharing a road, watching out for each other, filling the loneliness with voices that proved they weren't alone. He wanted to join them, wanted to key the mic and say, "I'm here too, I'm still here." But he couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely think. The conversation continued, the two drivers trading information about road conditions and truck stop coffee and the relative merits of different engine types. Normal trucker talk, the kind Clem had participated in thousands of times over the years. And underneath it, buried in the static, he heard other voices. Older voices, fainter, speaking in the same casual tones. Drivers from years past, decades past, their conversations frozen in the frequencies like insects in amber. All of them lost in the white. All of them still driving roads that didn't exist anymore, if they ever had. Clem's eyes drifted closed again. It would be so easy to join them, to let his voice add to that ghostly chorus, to become another fragment of static calling out into the void, another lost driver warning others away from roads they'd never find. Part of him wanted that. Wanted the company, the sense of belonging to something even if that something was just an endless convoy of the damned. But another part, the part that had kept him driving for 16 years through every kind of hell the road could throw at him, refused to accept it. He wasn't dead yet. The thought came slowly, fighting through the fog in his brain. He wasn't dead yet, which meant he still had a choice. He could give up, let the cold finish what it had started, or he could fight. It might be futile, might be nothing but prolonging the inevitable, but it was still a choice. And as long as he could choose, he was still himself, still Clem Redding, still a driver with miles to go. He forced his eyes open again and looked at the cab around him. Everything he needed to survive was here, if he could just make his body cooperate. The diesel heater under the dash, useless without power from the batteries. The emergency kit in the storage compartment behind the seat, containing road flares, emergency blankets, a first aid kit. The CB radio might be dead, but he had a cell phone in his coat pocket. Dead too, probably. The battery drained by the cold, but maybe, just maybe, if he could warm it up, coax a little life back into it. Moving was agony. Every muscle protested, joints grinding like rusted machinery, but Clem forced his hand into his coat pocket and pulled out the phone. The screen was black, unresponsive when he pressed the power button. He wrapped it in his hand, tucking it under his armpit, trying to transfer what little body heat he had left into the device. It was a long shot, worse than a long shot, but it was something to focus on besides the cold and the voices and the white. Minutes passed, or hours. Time had stopped meaning anything. Clem drifted again, his mind skating across memories and dreams and things that were neither. He was back in his first year of driving, sitting in a truck stop in Texas at 3 a.m, drinking terrible coffee and listening to an old-timer tell stories about the roads before GPS, before electronic logs, when navigation meant a paper atlas and dead reckoning. He was at his wedding, watching his wife walk down the aisle and knowing even then that it wouldn't last, that the road would always come between them. He was a child, sitting in his father's pickup, feeling the rumble of the engine and thinking this was the best thing in the world, this sense of movement and purpose and freedom. The phone buzzed in his hand, a tiny vibration that barely registered through his numb fingers. Clem's eyes snapped open and he pulled it out, staring at the screen. It had powered on, showing the startup logo, and for a moment his heart leaped. But then he saw the signal indicator. No bars, no service. Just like before, the storm and the terrain combining to cut him off from the rest of the world. He almost threw the phone, almost gave in to the despair that threatened to swallow him whole. But then he noticed something else. The battery indicator showed 3%. Not enough to make calls, not enough to browse the internet, but maybe enough for one thing. The emergency SOS feature, the one that sent out a distress signal on all available frequencies, bypassing normal cellular networks. Clem's fingers were too numb to navigate the touchscreen properly. It took him 3 tries to open the settings menu, his hand shaking so badly he kept hitting the wrong icons. But finally he found it. Emergency SOS. He pressed the button and the phone asked him to confirm. He pressed again and a countdown began. 3 seconds, 2, 1. The phone emitted a high-pitched tone and the screen displayed a message. Emergency signal sent. Authorities will be notified of your location if signal is received. If. That single word carried so much weight. If there was a tower within range. If the signal could penetrate the storm, if anyone was listening. But it was something, more than he'd had a moment ago, and Clem clung to that small hope like a drowning man clings to driftwood. The phone died, the battery finally giving out, and the screen went dark. Clem tucked it back into his pocket and pulled the sleeping bag tighter around himself. All he could do now was wait. Wait and hope, and try to stay conscious long enough for help to arrive, if it was coming at all. The wind outside had changed, he noticed. The constant howl had dropped to a lower pitch, and the cab wasn't rocking as violently as it had been. The storm was easing, or maybe moving on, leaving him behind in its wake. Through the frosted windshield he thought he could see lighter patches in the gray, hints that dawn might be coming. Or maybe that was just wishful thinking, his brain inventing hope where none existed. He heard the engines first, a deep rumble that cut through the wind's moan. Diesel engines, multiple of them, getting closer. Clem's eyes widened, and he tried to sit up, but his body wouldn't cooperate. The best he could manage was turning his head toward the driver's side window, watching as shapes materialized out of the white. Vehicles, big ones, trucks. For a moment, Clem's heart soared. Help had come. Someone had received his SOS, sent a rescue team. But as the shapes grew closer, his hope turned to confusion, then to dread. These weren't rescue vehicles, they were semis, 5 of them, moving in a convoy across the empty plain where the road should have been. No lights, no sound except the rumble of engines, and they weren't driving on pavement. They were driving on snow, through snow, as if the ground beneath them was as solid as asphalt. The ghost convoy, the one the voices had spoken about, the collection of lost drivers who'd become part of the white. Clem watched them pass, each truck identical to his own Peterbilt, and in each cab he could see a driver. They didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge his presence, just kept their eyes fixed straight ahead, hands on their wheels, driving toward a destination they'd never reach. The last truck in the convoy slowed as it drew alongside Clem's rig, and for the first time, the driver turned to look at him. It was Ward Hollister, or what Ward Hollister had become. His face pale and expressionless, eyes empty of everything except an infinite, terrible patience. He nodded once, a gesture that could have been greeting or acknowledgement or invitation. Then the truck accelerated, rejoining the convoy, and within moments they were gone, swallowed by the white as completely as if they'd never existed. Clem closed his eyes, tears freezing on his cheeks. He'd seen them, the lost ones, the drivers who'd given up or given in, who'd let the white take them and turn them into something that was no longer quite alive but not quite gone either. That was his future, he realized. Unless help came soon, that was what he'd become. Another truck in the convoy, another empty-eyed driver piloting a ghost rig through the storm for eternity. "No," he whispered, the word barely audible even to himself. "Not like that. I won't go like that." He forced his hand to move again, this time reaching for the door handle. If he was going to die, it wouldn't be sitting in this cab waiting for the cold to take him. He'd go out on his feet, walking, fighting, refusing to surrender even if surrender was the only logical choice. His fingers found the handle, pulled, and the door swung open, letting in a blast of wind that stole what little warmth remained in the cab. Clem half fell, half climbed down from the seat, his legs buckling when they hit the ground. He caught himself against the truck, using it for support, and forced himself upright. The world spun, his vision tunneling, but he took a step, then another, walking away from the truck, away from the gas station, toward nothing in particular, because there was nothing out here except white and more white. He made it maybe 50 feet before his legs gave out completely, and he collapsed into the snow. It was soft, almost welcoming, and for a moment Clem just lay there feeling the cold seep through his clothes and into his skin. This was it, he thought. This was how it ended. Not in the cab, not in the gas station, but out here in the open, buried under snow like Ward Hollister should have been all those years ago. But then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm, or the wind, or the ghost convoy. The whop, whop, whop of rotor blades cutting through air. A helicopter. Clem's eyes opened, and he looked up, searching the gray sky. There, breaking through the clouds, was a black shape with red and white markings. Wyoming Highway Patrol Search and Rescue. Clem tried to wave, tried to call out, but he didn't have the strength. All he could do was lie there and watch as the helicopter circled, spotlight sweeping across the snow, searching. The beam passed over him once, twice, and on the third pass it stopped, fixing him in its glare. The helicopter descended, snow swirling in the rotor wash, and Clem closed his eyes, relief flooding through him so intensely it hurt. Voices reached him, real voices, shouting over the noise of the helicopter. Hands grabbed him, lifted him, and he felt himself being moved, carried, Someone was talking to him, asking questions he couldn't understand, and he tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. Then there was warmth, blessed warmth, as they wrapped him in thermal blankets and loaded him into the helicopter. The door closed, the noise increased to a roar, and Clem felt the aircraft lift off, carrying him up and away from the white. He must have passed out then, because the next thing he knew he was in a hospital bed, lights too bright overhead, and someone was checking his vitals. A doctor, older man with kind eyes and gray hair, leaned over him. "Mr. Redding, can you hear me? You're in Regional West Medical Center in Scottsbluff. You were airlifted in about 3 hours ago. You're suffering from severe hypothermia and frostbite, but you're going to be okay. You got lucky. Another hour and we'd be having a different conversation." Clem tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. The doctor held a cup of water to his lips, helped him take a few sips. "My truck," Clem managed finally. "Where's my truck?" "Still out there," the doctor said. "Highway Patrol located it based on your emergency signal. They'll retrieve it once the roads are clear. Right now, we need to focus on warming you up slowly and making sure you don't lose any fingers or toes to frostbite." Over the next several days, as Clem recovered in the hospital, he learned what had happened. His emergency SOS had been received by a cell tower just outside Rock Springs, barely within range. The signal had been weak, intermittent, but enough for them to triangulate his approximate location. Highway Patrol had dispatched a helicopter once the worst of the storm passed, and they'd found him lying in the snow about 100 yards from an abandoned gas station that wasn't on any map. They'd also found his truck, and when they'd towed it back to civilization and inventoried the contents, they discovered the torn CB radio, the disconnected wires, and in the sleeper berth, a logbook that wasn't his. It was Ward Hollister's logbook, the same one Clem had found in the gas station office. The Highway Patrol investigator who'd interviewed Clem couldn't explain how it had gotten into his truck, couldn't explain a lot of things about what Clem had experienced. "Hypothermia can cause hallucinations," the investigator had said. "A woman named Pacheco with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Visual distortions, auditory phenomena, even complex narratives that seem completely real. You were in extreme physical distress for an extended period. Your brain was shutting down. What you remember might not be an accurate representation of what actually happened." Clem had nodded, accepting the explanation because it was easier than arguing. But he knew what he'd seen, what he'd heard. The voices on the radio, Ward Hollister's frozen body, the ghost convoy. Real or hallucination, it had felt true in the moment, and that was what mattered. The white had tried to take him, and he'd fought his way out. That was the only truth he needed. 3 weeks later, Clem was released from the hospital with most of his fingers and toes intact, though the frostbite on his left hand had been severe enough that he'd lost sensation in 2 fingertips. His truck had been repaired, the radio replaced, the damage from the cold assessed and fixed. The company he worked for had been understanding, putting him on light duty for a month while he recovered fully, and when he finally climbed back into the cab of a Peterbilt, it felt both familiar and alien at the same time. He took shorter runs for a while, routes that kept him closer to civilization, that didn't venture into the empty stretches where the white could swallow you whole.